This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima commencing stream for the 22nd of October 2022. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Hello, this is Chris VK3 Alpha Mike Lima commencing the YouTube live stream for this Saturday, the 22nd of October 2022. And hello from us in Melbourne. I'm starting the live stream a little bit early tonight because we have a fairly heavy night of inserts and recordings. Today is the last day that the Tasmanian ferry will be departing from Port Melbourne, and therefore a change of tradition for a lot of us in terms of the connection with Tasmania. From tomorrow, it will be departing from Geelong. That's great for Geelong people, possibly for interstate people, and for people from rural Victoria. Unfortunately for people like myself in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, remembering that the population, the demographic centre of Melbourne is somewhere around Glen Iris in the eastern suburbs, it doesn't mean too much in the way of getting down to the Tasmanian ferry in Geelong. We can take our time over that. But arriving back at 7 o'clock in the morning in Geelong and then having to negotiate the centre of the city and a lot more besides, the centre of the city of Melbourne at peak hour with probably not much of a night's sleep beforehand is a bit frightening. So I'll be very interested to see how from this point onwards the commercial results of the Tasmanian ferry go. I suspect that there'll be a slight slump, at least for the first few months. Now, one of the reasons I've started early tonight, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima incidentally, with the regular Saturday night test transmission, is that in sympathy for those in northern Victoria who've suffered through the floods and continue to suffer through the floods, I'd like to show you a slideshow of material that was sent to me by Neil VK3KAL just this afternoon from Alexandra, showing some of the damage up there. This is Breakaway Caravan Park at Ackeron, just south of Alexandra, near the junction of the Goulburn and Ackeron rivers, and the photos were taken by Neil 3KAL. That's what happens to a river when the river floods and a bridge is involved. This was the bridge this afternoon. Major parts of the roadway have washed away, as you can see there. I think people should use those secondary roads with some caution at the moment. That's the Breakaway Caravan Park at Ackeron, near the confluence of the Ackeron and Goulburn rivers. And as you can see, the Goulburn and the Ackeron have broken their banks and are spreading fairly badly everywhere. So the sodden paddocks of the Alexandra area, courtesy of Neil VK3KAL, to whom I extend my thanks and sympathies for sending these pictures of today. This is a house of a friend my wife and I used to stay with in Rochester. We still do when we can. This was taken on the 15th of October, and that's her house, taken from what was the street in front. The house is just above the floodwaters. They've been lucky. All of their sheds are flooded, probably quite a bit of their equipment ruined. So again, my sympathies there. And this house was in higher ground than most. So people have really suffered through this flood. And this was taken on the 15th, which was last Saturday, in Rochester, the outskirts of Rochester. Now, to add insult to injury, or at least to complete the report, these additional photos were sent by Neil VK3KAL only a couple of hours ago, and as you can see, the bridge on some of the on this secondary road, I think over the Ackeron River, has been destroyed. The approaches to it have washed away. Let's have a look at some drone pictures of the area. As you can see, it's pretty severe, and people would be very ill-advised to take their cars through those floodwaters. You never know where there is actually a road surface under the water and what might be there in the way of snakes or whatever. So take care, please, people. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with a regular Saturday night test transmission. And tonight the theme is local radio manufacture, past and present. Let's start with the past. The Racophone Company in Sydney was started by Raymond Cottam Allsop. I'll just show you a picture of the guy concerned. Ray Allsop. And there he is in the mid-1930s. Ray had been trained as a teenager in the Reverend Father Shaw's Maritime Wireless Works at Randwick before the First World War, the company that built many of the low-frequency ship-to-shore transmitters around Australia in the couple of years before the First World War. Later, he became an engineer for several of the Sydney broadcasting stations, 2FC, and various others. And in 1928, he started work on talking motion pictures, initially making a few experimental sound-on-disc films in the studios of 2FC, and later, much more successfully commercially, making sound heads, optical sound conversion systems for silent projectors, so that companies that didn't want to pay the huge licensing fees for Western electric equipment from America could remain in business. So Ray Allsop was behind the Racophone Company, which made those sound heads and radios, and he got his friend, the announcer A.S. Cochrane, to record the narration for this documentary, made in 1935. You can see the video that goes with this by Googling VK3AML 22 October 2022. That'll take you to our YouTube live stream. VK3AML 22 October 2022.
Let us introduce to you some intimate glimpses of the Racophone works at Annandale. Racophone are the pioneer Australian sound equipment manufacturers and are also manufacturers of radio sets and accessories. On entering the machine shop, one is impressed with the variety of work carried on. Material is purchased in bulk and, with the aid of modern machinery, is turned out in the form of chassis, washers, valve socket contacts, volume controls, and a host of other parts. All the necessary dies and tools for these jobs are produced in the machine shop and are made and fitted with the most accurate care and skill. The tools for these chassis having been completed and set in the press, it is a simple matter for the operator to take the sheets of steel, place them under the press, and thus produce a completed chassis ready to take the components for the particular amplifier for which it has been designed. This is the foundation of the amplifier, and every attention has been given to laying it out in such a way that all its components will function without electrical interference from each other. The steel from which it is made has been thoroughly tested in the Racophone laboratory and is imported from England specially for the company. On the turret lathe, 6 operations are performed consecutively. In the making of terminals, bars of metal are fed to the lathe on runners. By a movement of the side lever, the operator brings through the required length of metal. A turn of the capstan head checks the length, another turn drills the hole through its center, the next turn countersinks the hole, a pull of the center lever bevels the end, and finally a forward movement severs the terminal from the bar. Rigid inspection by the foreman ensures absolute accuracy of all jobs. Steel and fiber gears are another of the essentials, and these require an accuracy which to the layman seems impossible. 1/10,000th of an inch would be too great an error for this universal milling machine. No job is too small and none too large for this modern factory. Note how this cast iron bed plate is being played with. No effort, no trouble. The junior equipment consists of an aluminium base upon which rests the motor, the sound head and the lamp house. The bases are cast in alloy and neatly finished on a universal milling machine which lends itself to accurate working standards. The bosses on the top of the base are milled to a perfect finish to make an even bed for the sound head. Any unevenness here will throw out the alignment of the head, which in turn will cause noisy gears. The gears, shafts, bushes and other small parts having been made, the assembly of the sound head is next commenced. The sound head, which has been cast and machined with the same accuracy as all the components, has two functions. Firstly, to pull down the film from the projector, and secondly, by means of the optical unit, to pick up the sound from the sound track. The mechanic must be exceptionally careful in the adjustment of the optical system, for the focusing of the beam of light on the sound track is equivalent to the sharp point of a gramophone needle. Rakophone prepared for extended frequency range as far back as 18 months ago by the incorporation of the new optical system and curved sound gate in Rakophone sound equipments. The amplifier seen here is the part of the junior type sound equipment which has proved popular with so many showmen. To develop the necessary amplifiers and to definitely prove that they would cover wide ranges of frequency in the audible spectrum, a very necessary piece of apparatus called a standard beat frequency oscillator was imported. This oscillator produces frequencies from 16 to 12,000 cycles per second, and the calibration is so accurate that it does not vary 1 point in several millions. Under the old type of sound equipment, the frequency range of the amplifier and the speakers was limited to those frequencies between 70 cycles per second and 4,500 cycles per second. With the introduction of extended frequency range, this limit has been extended to cover all frequencies between 10,000 cycles per second and 30 cycles per second. Leaving the production of theatre sound equipment, let us now pay a visit to the laboratory where Rakophone radio sets are developed. Here we see the engineers developing a 5-valve chassis, making tests on its sensitivity, selectivity and fidelity. All these measurements are made so that the performance of a receiver is definitely known long before it actually receives a radio signal. This enables the engineers to know if the particular type of receiver is suited for the purpose for which it is being built. Nothing is left to chance by the technical staff in their efforts to keep abreast of radio developments. The results of these figures are plotted in the form of graphs. The particular graph you see is the result of tests made for selectivity. The assembling of component parts for radio requires close supervision. Every part is tested before going into the production line. One of the most important of these components is the coil. This consists of an insulating former upon which is wound several hundred turns of specially coated wire, much thinner than the ordinary household silk thread. The winding is checked with the aid of a magnifying glass to see that it is even, as there must be no variation in the spaces between the turns. After winding and finishing off, they are transferred to the impregnating plant, where they are dipped in a special waterproof solution. While this may not be necessary for some localities, it is essential that Rakophone radio stands up to every climate particularly the humid atmosphere of the islands to the north of Australia, where the products of this firm are very well patronized. Testing and matching is carried out after impregnating by means of a special oscillator built by Rakophone for that purpose. So fine is the adjustment of this oscillator that the placing of a small piece of metal within 6 inches of the coil while it is under test will immediately be registered. To ensure no such interference when the coil is on the chassis, special coil cans have been produced to house the coils. Cadmium plating is used throughout for these components requiring a hard finish, that method having proven to be the only satisfactory surface for the carrying out of radio frequency currents. The factory also has a modern Duco plant, which is used for the external finishing of its products. A glance at the radio assembly line reveals the methodical way in which the set is built up. Each employee does his own small section of the work. This means he becomes extremely skillful in this section. We see how the chassis was produced from the presses in the machine shop, also how it was plated. The next step is the addition of the valve sockets, the aerial and the earth terminals, electrolytic condensers, power transformers, intermediate frequency transformers, gang condenser and dial. Wiring operations beneath the chassis are then begun. All resistors and condensers are mounted on a Bakelite strip, which is placed in the base of the chassis. This strip is a distinct feature of Rakophone radio. So much care is exercised in testing every part before it reaches the assembly line that every chassis coming off the line is ready for final test in the screen test room. Here, the operator puts the set through a final test, lines the condensers, seals them, and thoroughly tests the chassis for reception on the broadcasting stations. These test rooms are modernly equipped with all available apparatus. After passing this test, it is now ready for cabinet fitting. Here, it is bolted in the cabinet, the speaker is mounted on its baffle, the escutcheons placed on the cabinet, and the completed set is again tested before being finally dispatched to fulfill waiting orders. Amongst the outstanding sets produced during the last few months is the Rakophone Pee-wee. At the time of production, this little fellow was really the smallest set on the Australian market. The Rakophone Pee-wee. We hope that this tour of inspection of the Rakophone works has convinced you of the excellence of Rakophone products.
And that was from 1935. The Rakophone works in Booth Street, Annandale in Sydney. This is VK3AML. And if you're listening on 2 meters and care to Google VK3AML 22 October 2022, that's 22 October 2022, you'll find the video that goes with this audio stream. When I started in broadcasting about 1975, one of the first turntables that I came across in broadcasting was made by CEI, Commonwealth Electronic Industries. And I didn't know it at the time, but they are a rare factory product from Hobart, Tasmania. And let's have a look at a film with an interview with Bill Nicholas, who was the head of CEI in 1968, talking about the manufacture of those turntables. Apparently it was the product of a wartime works that had to be turned to civilian production, so they thought, broadcasting, turntables. So that specialist product came out of Hobart for about 30 years after the war. Over to Bill Nicholas.
Mr. Nicholas, how did Commonwealth turntables get started in the first place?
It started originally, John, at a local commercial station, 7HT, where I was employed in approximately 1947. A lot of viewers will probably remember that in those days practically all the commercial programs were made up of disc recordings, both music and what we called soap operas in those days, which were practically all recorded on large 16-inch discs running at 33 1/3 revs. And they presented quite a problem because in almost every case the disc had to be stopped at least twice and either a live or recorded commercial fitted in and then the disc cued and started off again. Well, the volume of business gradually built up and we got more and more trouble in trying to handle these discs on the old 12-inch turntables. So of course there was a necessity for something bigger and better and more powerful. So I designed one, a 16-inch turntable, especially for these discs, and made up, I think it was 2 we made up for a start, and they proved quite successful. I think we made 4 altogether at that station, and they continued on for quite a few years there. And then when this company was originally formed in 1951, as the original Commonwealth Electronics, we were looking for something to make. So of course we thought, well, perhaps we could make turntables. So that was the start of our original Model 16A, which was designed with the old 7HT ones in mind. It was just cleaned up a bit, and we put it into limited production. I think at the time we thought we'd be lucky if we sold about 40, but the 16A and the smaller model, the 12A, sold I think something like 12 to 1,500.
And so now you're continuing with this 12-inch one we've got in front of us.
Well, this one is quite different to the original ones, and this one was originally designed to meet a PMG specification which came out for the National Broadcasting Service, and it was more or less designed in collaboration with PMG engineers in Melbourne. They made certain suggestions about, minor improvements which we put into it, and it's remained like that ever since.
And in fact, we've got some of these right in the ABC studios now.
Yes, you've got several hundred of them, I think.
Now, what about the manufacturer? Is it all done locally?
About 95% of it, John, done here.
What does that involve in the first stage?
Well, the first stage is the collection of raw material, of course. We do quite a bit of our own casting, die casting. That's limited to the small components. If we could just point out here, the idler wheel, the bearing housing and the cam bracket are just a couple of items that I can think of.
Yep.
They're made here locally. And the 2 big components, the turntable and surround, are made at local foundries in Hobart.
After the casting, what happens then?
The casting's inspected, and then in the case of the turntable in particular, which is one of the vital parts, it's turned all over. It's a precision turning job, and the inside diameter of the turntable is critical because it partly controls the speed of the machine, and that is turned to a tolerance of 0.02 of an inch. The main frame of the machine, what we call the surround, is also turned all over. So we've got a true base on all surfaces to mount our different parts of.
What about other parts of it?
Well, the other parts mainly involve drilling and reaming and milling, just straightforward operations.
You've got quite an impressive spindle there.
Yes, the spindle, of course, on which the turntable revolves, is a key component, and it's very important. And that's ground all over and finished by diamond lapping on this surface. And it runs in a white metal sleeve in what we call a bearing housing.
Now, when you've got all the components manufactured, what about the assembly? What happens there?
Well, the assembly's quite straightforward, John. We put all the machines on this rack here, or rather we put all the surround castings on the rack, and then we just put the different sub-assemblies and components in on a sort of a modified production line. In this case, we've got one machine up to the stage where it'll run, and the others are in various stages of assembly.
Now, your manufacture involves fully professional turntables. What sort of a demand is there on a world basis now?
It's this type of machine. It's a limited demand item because it's mainly taken by professional people, TV stations, recording studios and broadcasting stations. Some hi-fi enthusiasts buy them, but of course they're rather expensive since they're made in small quantities.
How much, in fact, would they cost, basically?
Well, the basic machine is approximately $125.
This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. There was a bit of background noise on that wasn't on the original recording, and I can't trace where it's coming from. So I hope that doesn't affect our subsequent video inserts. Let's go on now to more modern makers of materials, and specifically to Codan, who have been making Royal Flying Doctor Service radios since the year dot, but more recently they've specialised, as they have to, in competition with producers in China and elsewhere, in top-of-the-range gear that has internet connectivity and the possibility for multiple encoding for military use, also for remote area use where people's lives rely on it. And these days with Codan, they're interested in internet connectivity with digital input, in other words digital audio and digital data. So let's look at a promotional film from Codan. This is promoting a product of theirs called the Codan Envoy. I hope we don't run into problems with this because this is from their site, and so I'm hoping that this will not constitute advertising. It's more a tour of what they do and what they make. And after this I'll deal with the production houses of Barrett in Perth, Western Australia, and GME in Sydney, who are among our few surviving transceiver makers in Australia. Codan.
Mr. Nicholas, how did Commonwealth turntables get started in the first place?
It started originally, John.
Welcome to Codan Radio Communications. This video is part of a series on radio fundamentals and introduces the HF or high frequency radio technology. We are surrounded by all sorts of invisible particles and waves, some of which are charged, and these moving charges result in electric and magnetic fields. When electric and magnetic fields couple with each other at a right angle, it results in the formation of electromagnetic waves. These waves travel in a direction which is perpendicular to both the fields. They travel through space at the speed of light, and just like light, electromagnetic waves can travel through a vacuum as well. Electromagnetic waves come in varying forms of frequency and amplitude. Even heat and light are forms of electromagnetic waves. Radio waves are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The radio wave spectrum has a large range of radio waves, from maritime navigation signals used by ships, which are very low frequency, or VLF, to satellite signals, which are extremely high frequency, or EHF. In this presentation, we are going to focus on the HF, or high frequency radio waves, and how they are used in communications. The range of HF radio waves is between 3 to 30 MHz, according to the electromagnetic spectrum. The typical range of modern HF radios is 1.6 to 30 MHz. So how did we know about electromagnetic waves and radio waves? It all started with James Clerk Maxwell's treatise on electricity and magnetism in 1873. The first radio waves were detected 15 years later by Heinrich Rudolf Hertz, whose practical experiments supported Maxwell's theories. Heinrich's work inspired Guglielmo Marconi's early experiments with wireless telegraphy, using Morse code. In 1901, Marconi successfully demonstrated wireless communication from Cornwall, England to Newfoundland, Canada, a distance of 3,000 kilometres. So the radio waves that Marconi used were the high frequency or the HF radio waves. How does HF radio technology work? A transmitting antenna, shown as TX, emits the HF radio waves, and a receiving antenna, shown as RX, receives these radio waves. There are three types of HF radio waves. Ground wave, which is good for short-distance communication at less than 20 kilometres. It follows the curvature of the Earth and is therefore attenuated. Direct wave, which can be used for long-distance communication between ground stations and aircraft. And finally, skywave, which uses the ionosphere to refract the signal back to Earth at varying angles, providing long-distance communications. As you can see, skywave covers the maximum distance. We are most interested in skywave to propagate signals. A layer in the atmosphere called the ionosphere refract the HF radio waves, making this technology work over long distance. The angle of the antenna is responsible for the coverage area as it aims the radio waves which are bounced off the ionosphere. This also creates a skip zone, where the ground wave ends and the skywave starts, where the radio waves are not present as they are not refracted into this area. To reduce or overcome a skip zone, the takeoff angle of the antenna is adjusted. By using a higher takeoff angle for the HF signal, the ionosphere is used to refract the signal back to Earth at a shorter distance. All sorts of voice, data or signals can be sent using these waves. The ionosphere itself is made of several different layers that refract the HF radio waves in different ways. These range from the closest layer that exists in the day, called layer D, to the farthest layer called F2. These different layers behave differently in the way that they refract HF radio waves. The D layer in particular can weaken or attenuate the HF radio waves, as it contains a higher number of charged particles due to the sunlight. The most common layers used for signal propagation are the F1 and F2. These layers change between day and night. A basic rule for HF radio signals is to use higher frequency radio waves during the day, as higher frequency waves will travel further using the ionosphere. The higher the sun, the higher the frequency required. The higher the frequency, the longer the distance the HF radio waves will travel. What are some of the other factors that can affect HF radio waves? Solar flares can alter the refracting property of the ionosphere. 11-year solar cycles can either hinder or improve the HF radio waves. And finally, something man-made, such as power stations which produce electrical noise, can affect the reception of HF signals. Apart from these factors, communication through HF radio waves depends on a few other things, like location, local radio rules and regulations, planning for the frequency sets to be used. So if you have the right antenna and these factors covered, you are on your way in the world of reliable long-distance HF radio communications. Codan Radio Communications. Be heard. We go where you go to ensure your people will always be heard.
And now Codan shows their product, the Codan Envoy. I'll read this out. A new standard in HF radio. A smart radio series using the software-defined radio architecture with digital voice, IP connectivity, embedded software modem and multi-language support. Codan has their own YouTube channel. You can look them up there. As there's no narration on this, I'll just read out the titles as they come. They're showing various aspects of Codan radio using the Envoy system, which is a system rather than a radio. It's an IP modem as well as a radio. It's fully internet integrated if it's needed. Dave is an aid worker and travels throughout most harsh and remote parts of Africa. Out here, Dave knows that his sat phone has no coverage. And he's been frustrated by the hissing and crackling of standard analogue HF radios. That's why Dave's organisation has equipped their fleet of vehicles with Codan Envoys, the new standard in HF radio. Codan Envoy uses the latest software-defined architecture, which means that you can download and upgrade new capabilities through software. And with Envoy's USB Smart Loader, getting crystal clear communications is as simple as plugging in a USB stick and profiling your Envoy with digital voice. Dave is first on the scene at a major flood within the province of Luanda Norte, Angola. Dave understands that when lives are on the line, every second counts. With a Codan Envoy and digital voice enabled, he makes an emergency voice call.
Hello HQ, this is Dave in vehicle 111. There's been a flood. Need assistance. Do you copy? Over.
As Dave places the call, the Envoy's Codan automated link management system features its built-in intelligence to determine the most efficient frequency. The high-frequency radio bounces off the ionosphere, travelling some 1,000 kilometres. The HF signal is received at the remote site in Luanda, 1,000 k's away, which is equipped with an Envoy RF unit. And it shows the unit. Because Codan Envoy is the only IP-capable and wireless network interoperable HF radio of its kind, you can get your message to anywhere in the world. The Envoy RF unit at the remote station at Luanda sends Dave's message via IP to the base in Madrid.
Hello HQ, this is Dave.
Dave's emergency ALE call and GPS coordinates reach Raul at the head office in Madrid.
Hello Dave, this is HQ. We read you loud and clear. We have your GPS coordinates from your emergency call. Can you send an email with a picture of the situation? Over.
Meanwhile, back at Luanda, Dave receives Raul's message. Dave takes a photo of the emergency, composes an email on his Tough book and sends it to Raul via the Envoy RF unit. Through the fully embedded software modem, Envoy delivers advanced features such as high-speed data, email and chat, all in a compact HF solution. In Madrid, back at base, Raul receives from Dave. Because Raul's Envoy desk console has Spanish language profile, the notification is displayed in Raul's native language. With the ability to support an unlimited number of additional languages, Envoy provides you with a truly customisable solution, no matter what language you speak. Raul operates Dave's email and dispatches a backup unit to assist Dave in Luanda Norte. And there you see the basis of an internet-integrated radio designed by a company in Adelaide, Codan. And I suggest strongly, if you're interested to see what their system is like, what their product is like, or even to look into the factory of Codan, copy down that URL and have a look for yourself.
Codan Radio Communications. Be heard. We go where you go to ensure your people will always be heard.
Another organisation
Introducing the Barrett Communications 4050 HF software-defined radio. The 4050 SDR combines advanced, fully software-defined architecture with a highly intuitive, user-friendly touchscreen interface which creates unparalleled ease of use, a concept that for 40 years has been synonymous with Barrett HF transceivers. Taking this ethos further, the 4050 HF SDR will be shipped with English, French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian and Chinese languages as standard. Some of the many features of the 4050 HF SDR are the high-resolution touchscreen display, IP network connectivity, enhanced DSP noise reduction, 2G and 3G automatic link establishment, advanced calling features and secure digital voice. The Barrett 4050 SDR transceiver can also be controlled from all major mobile and desktop platforms. The 4050 SDR handset app supports iOS, Android and Windows devices, providing unprecedented wireless remote access to all transceiver functionality. For more information, please go to barrettcommunications.com.au/SDR.
And they're based in Perth. And now a little bit more about Barrett. The Barrett 4050 HF SDR Analog versus Digital Voice Demonstration.
Hello, my name's Rob and this is Ben, and we're both from Barrett Communications. Today we're going to talk about the 4050 SDR radio, new from Barrett Communications, the digital voice in comparison to analog voice. Ben, can you explain what that means to us, please?
Okay, Rob. So what we've got with the 4050 SDR is we now have a digital voice option. Previously, we've always had difficulties with analog communications in noisy environments. Now with the digital voice option, we can get a much better signal to noise ratio, or we can get much more like a telephone conversation. We don't have that background constant interference. We can take all of that out of the signal and we can just amplify the voice, which makes it a very, very workable signal when we have bad conditions.
So Ben, you seem to have brought us to what would appear to be a non-optimal environment for HF communications. Could you tell us really what that means, and especially with using the SDR radio with digital voice?
Yeah, so Rob, where we've come out to is about 90 kilometres southeast of the Barrett factory in Perth. It's Australian bush. It's not an ideal location, and we come here a lot for our testings because of that distance being 90 kilometres away from our base station. It's not great for ground wave, and we're not far enough away to be getting a good skywave signal coming in. So this is a good opportunity for us to demonstrate and to show the advantages of using digital voice in environments or situations where signals are hard to receive.
So Ben, can you explain to us please the equipment we're going to be using for today's demonstration?
Okay, so today we're going to be using the 2019 mobile antenna tuning unit. It's got our stainless steel extendable whip on there. That's connected up to the 4050 that's inside the vehicle via the control cable. So we'll go through and have a look at that now.
So can you talk us through what you got set up here, please, Ben?
Okay, Rob. So what I've got installed at the moment is the SDR front panel. Okay, this is remoted from the transceiver. I've used one of the control cables. It's about 6 metres long, which is a standard sort of size for most vehicle installations. Now, one of the innovative features that Barrett's introduced with the SDR radio is this high definition touchscreen. Much like you see on all your smartphones today, we can now operate the radio by using the touchscreen capabilities. So if I want to change menu options, change any of the configurations, I've got full functionality from the touchscreen.
So Ben, I see you have a tablet here. What's the tablet for?
Okay, Rob, the SDR has a Wi-Fi capability. So in the top of the control head here, we've got a little Wi-Fi dongle. I can now sync that up to any Windows, Android or iOS operating system. So what I've got running here is the Windows application on our tablet. Very easily I can sync it up. And I've now got all the controls that I had on my SDR front panel. I've now got them all through the Windows application. You can see I've got channel change. I can make different types of calls. It's all here as if it was using the front panel of the SDR.
So what happens if I take the tablet away?
Well, what we've got now, Rob, is we've now got a wireless control of the radio. So for example, I can take the tablet out. I could be at a campsite 5-10 metres away from the car, and I've got full function control of my radio. I've also got PTT and audio, so I can send calls and use all the full functions again from the tablet.
The base station is 90 kilometres from the land mobile station. Conditions are deliberately representing a difficult environment. The land station is using a Barrett 4050 SDR HF radio and Barrett 2019 automatic tuning HF mobile antenna. The demonstration was recorded.
Okay, Rob, I'm going to try and make a call back to the Barrett base. So we're doing an ALE call. We've got the ALE 2G capability with the radio as well. So you can just hear there, that's the reply coming back from the base station. So I can just hear that bass coming in. Barrett base, this is Barrett Mobile. Radio check over. See, I can't hear him, Rob, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to activate my digital voice and try again. Barrett base, this is Barrett Mobile. Radio check now, over.
Barrett Mobile, this is Barrett base. You are loud and clear, over.
That's the digital version.
Barrett base, this is Barrett Mobile. I'm receiving you loud and clear, Your analogue signal to me was very weak, barely readable. Obviously now using the digital voice function of the SDR, I've now made a unworkable channel, very workable, over.
Roger, yes, you are coming through loud and clear. What is your location, over?
Okay, currently I'm located about 90 kilometres southeast of the factory, of your location. I'm in Australian bush and we're driving down a track, currently mobile at about 20 kilometres an hour. Over.
Roger, understood, over.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Barrett base. This is Barrett Mobile, and I'll contact you when we are returning back to your location. This is Barrett Mobile out. So that there, demonstration of the significant advantage of having a digital voice capability in your radio, Rob.
That's pretty impressive, Liv.
And now another company, GME in Sydney, who make mainly UHF CB stuff.
GME is a 100% Australian-owned and operated private company based in Winston Hills in northwest Sydney. Our company mission is to create and deliver innovative, customised communication solutions. Welcome to GME. Founded in 1959 by Ted Dunn, GME remains focused on technology leadership in the RF communications space, with an unwavering commitment to Australian manufacturing, now and into the future. GME is the only Australian manufacturer of UHF CB radios and emergency beacons, offering our customers a number of unique advantages over imported products from our competitors. We produce a vast range of products spanning UHF CB radios, antennas, EPIRBs, PLBs, VHF marine radios, professional radios, and accessories under the GME brand. We also maintain a significant presence in the TV signal distribution market under our Kingray brand. GME currently employs over 180 Australians, including a team of more than 40 highly skilled specialist engineers, focused on designing and developing cutting-edge RF communications products to meet the requirements of a wide range of vertical markets. These markets include agriculture, heavy vehicle, recreational four-wheel drive, recreational and commercial marine, government, defence, and many more. GME's ability to maintain sustainable and profitable growth in the face of intense competition and downward price pressure from imported competitor products can be attributed in part to a passion for listening to and understanding our customers' specific needs. These customers' needs are translated into the delivery of market-leading products through our in-house capability, covering research and development, engineering, quality assurance, manufacturing, warehousing, sales and marketing, finance and technical service. With a diverse workforce and over 35% female employees, the management team at GME consistently remain focused on one of our key core values. Our people are our strength. GME sustains a persistent emphasis on innovation in RF design, often leading the market in terms of technological innovation and efficiency in design. Our in-house R&D team is tasked with monitoring global trends in technology across industry, investigating and validating potential new platforms, and driving continual growth in technical knowledge and capability. GME places a substantial importance on investment into our engineering capability from both a resource and capital perspective. This is clearly demonstrated by the development of our best-in-class rapid prototyping centre and environmental test facility, allowing us to create and test prototypes in-house with no reliance on third-party businesses. These capabilities enable considerable efficiencies to development timelines and assurance that intellectual property remains secure and protected within Australia. A passion for delivering quality products and experiences to our customers underpins everything we do here at GME. Our customers are of utmost importance to the team at GME, and we actively seek direct input to product development from the market through participation in industry events, trade shows, focus groups, and numerous other customer touchpoints, including our websites and social media platforms. This feedback enables us to continuously improve our product designs to not only meet and exceed customer expectations, but also provide years of reliable performance in the harsh Australian environment. GME's unrivaled quality is demonstrated by our extremely low failure rate of less than 1% across all products. GME's exceptional quality is further reinforced by our Australian Trusted Trader accreditation, ISO 9001 accredited manufacturing facility, and participation in the Australian Made campaign. Australian manufacturing is the backbone of GME's operation, with over 80% of our annual revenue generated by Australian-made products. Our ongoing commitment to Australian manufacturing is supported by significant capital investment, with recent major upgrades, including the commission of a new state-of-the-art surface mount technology line to increase our local production capacity of printed circuit boards, in line with strong growth in demand for GME products. On behalf of the entire team at GME, we thank you for your continued support to our business and brand, and look forward to a long and prosperous future, working together.
And no, this is not a series of adverts on VK3AML. I'm covering every Australian manufacturer. So far as I'm aware, there are only about 3 or 4 of them at the moment. And let's go on to GME's antenna situation. They give some rather interesting advice about the antennas that they make. So ignore the commercial side of this. This is more of scientific interest.
Hi guys, Tony from GME. Today I'm coming to you direct from our antenna production facility right here in Winston Hills, Sydney, Australia. This facility produces more than 20,000 antennas a month across more than 50 different models. Now, I know a lot of you are confused about why there's so many different antenna models and what the differences are. And today, in this video, we're going to try and explain to you what all the different antennas do and the applications that they suit. Alright guys, so we got kicked out of the antenna production facility. Apparently we were getting in the way. We've come back upstairs to the studio. It's a little quieter and we're not going to interrupt the really important work the guys are doing downstairs, building antennas for you. Now when it comes to selecting antennas, it can be really confusing. There are a lot of different antennas available in the GME range, and today we're going to try and explain to you what some of the key differences are to make selecting the right antenna for your application a lot easier. So when we talk antennas, you'll hear a lot of different terminology used and it can become really confusing. We're going to try and simplify that for you today. And one of the first things that you'll hear, particularly if you start researching on the internet, is ground dependent and ground independent antennas. Now, ground dependent antennas require a ground plane in order to function correctly. So think a large flat piece of metal that the antenna is mounted to ensure that it performs correctly. Now, traditionally that would have meant drilling a hole through the centre of the roof of your vehicle and mounting the antenna there, which is somewhat undesirable. The good news is technology has developed and created ground independent antennas, which are able to perform in isolation without the requirement for a ground plane, which allows you to mount them on your bull bar, on small antenna mounting brackets on the guard, and basically anywhere that is not directly in the centre of the roof of your vehicle. We have a huge range of both ground dependent and ground independent antennas, but it's really important that you understand the key differences, because if you mount a ground dependent antenna away from the ground plane, you're not going to get the optimal performance. And unfortunately, when we're out and about, we do see that pretty often. So here we've got an example of a ground dependent antenna. This particular antenna is suited for agricultural vehicles, so think tractors. You can mount this thing on the roof of the tractor, ensuring it's got a ground plane, and you'll get fantastic performance. If you were to mount that antenna on your bull bar of your four-wheel drive, however, it's not going to work very well. Now when we move to ground independent antennas, as I mentioned, they don't require a ground plane. In order to do this, they need a couple of other parts. So here we've got what's known as an elevated feed antenna. Now this is the elevated feed, and then you've got your whip on top. And there's a number of different varieties of elevated feed antennas. The one that I've got here is a stainless steel whip. This is designed for the heavy vehicle industry predominantly. So mirror mounting on your Kenworths, on your Macs and your Volvos, these are not designed for use on four-wheel drive vehicles. The vibrations that an antenna experiences when it's mounted on the bull bar, particularly on a diesel vehicle, will quite simply result in the antenna whip vibrating itself to death. It'll break. If you're going for an elevated feed style antenna for your four-wheel drive, we have a number of models available with a fiberglass whip. Now the fiberglass whip will still mount on the same elevated feed base, so it's still a ground independent style antenna, but because it's a fiberglass design, it will cope much better with the vibrations experienced in a four-wheel drive situation. Stepping up yet again, we've got what's known as our radome style antennas. So our most popular one is the 4705 here, which is a pretty serious looking antenna, and this is designed for hardcore four-wheel drive applications. It still has an elevated feed style design, but the elevated feed is contained in this aluminium ferrule. The radiating element of the antenna is inside this large fiberglass radome. These things are built super tough, and this is the sort of antenna that you're looking for if you're mounting it on the bull bar of your hardcore four-wheel drive, something that's going to put up with a lot of abuse in the bush, or if you're driving heavily corrugated roads in the Australian outback, these are the style of antennas that you want to go for. So they're the main technical differences, and then you'll notice that within each of these styles of antenna, we've got a huge range of different lengths, thicknesses and colours. Now, when it comes to colour, that's an easy one. Choose the colour that you like the best or that will suit the look of your vehicle. When it comes to the thickness, or indeed the size of the spring, that's generally related to the amount of punishment that the antenna will take. So the 4705 that I just showed you, it's got a really big solid spring on the bottom of it. It's going to put up with the most abuse in probably the harshest conditions that you're likely to experience. Right down to the smaller springs, lighter duty, suited for vehicles that might be towing a caravan on bitumen and are unlikely to see any off-road conditions. Now when it comes to the length of the antenna, it's very important. Bigger is not necessarily better when it comes to antennas. Shorter antennas generally have lower gain. Our range starts at 2.1 dBi. What that means is that the antenna produces a more rounded radiation pattern. It won't transmit as far as a longer antenna with higher gain, but in hilly, mountainous terrain or in built-up areas, that more rounded radiation pattern will actually give you better performance than a longer, high-gain antenna, which has a much flatter or narrower radiation pattern. Now, if you're out in the middle of the Nullarbor Plain, for example, a longer antenna with higher gain is going to give you much greater transmission distance than a shorter antenna with lower gain. Our antennas go right up to 8.1 dBi of gain, but they're also 2.4 metres long. If you were to use that style of antenna in the high country in Victoria, you're going to get terrible performance. This is why GME offers a range of antennas with interchangeable whips. So the 4700 series that I mentioned here, you can unscrew the base and spring from the whip, and you can interchange the whips to suit the terrain that you're travelling in. So these particular bases will accept a 2.1, a 6.6 or an 8.1 dBi whip, which enables you to have the best performance to suit the terrain that you're in. And that's what you need to keep in mind. Of course, I know some of you want the look of the big antennas on the front of the vehicle, but you just need to remember that it won't always give you the best performance. So that's probably enough for today without getting too technical. Keep in mind though, there's a huge amount of information about antennas on gme.net.au, but if there's anything specific that you'd like to know, feel free to leave a comment below, and if I don't know the answer to it, I'll ask one of our much smarter engineers, and we'll be able to get back to you to answer any question that you might have in relation to GME antennas.
So, with thanks to the 3 surviving Australian transceiver and antenna manufacturers, I know there are more, but I've tried to cover the field as broadly as possible so that I'm not effectively promoting any single one. Presenting these more with the idea of showing you something of the specialities of those 3 Australian makers, Codan, Barrett, GME. I'm not associated financially in any way with those. In fact, on this YouTube live stream, I'm not associated financially with anything at all, unfortunately. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night transmission and simultaneous YouTube live stream. If you'd like to look in on the videos accompanying this, please Google the phrase VK3AML 22 October 2022. That's Google the phrase VK3AML 22 October 2022. Well, finally, we'll go over to a documentary, a landmark documentary of its time, made 91 years ago by one of the pioneers of the documentary film movement, Joris Ivens, who was a young Dutch filmmaker, I think 29 years of age when he made this film, for Philips in Eindhoven. Philips, much later, of course, had branches in Australia and New Zealand producing, I think it was the Philips 828 and the Philips FM 900 that many of you will know. But in the early 30s, they were hand-making transmitting tubes and making receiving triodes in huge numbers. As you'll see, they were making tungsten filament lamps as well as valves. And I believe in 1931 they were the biggest radio manufacturing concern in the world. So without any further ado, I'll open it up for the Philips documentary, which is introduced by Joris Ivens, who made it. It's a landmark film because of the way it was made. That is Joris Ivens, taken in 1931. With his camera, and you'll see an interview with him in 1982, filmed in French, so I'll read the translation.
Une autre fois, quand je suis chez Philips, tu vois comment ça s'appelle, souffleur de verre.
One time when I was at Philips, there was still handwork back then. The man had a formless lump of glass hanging from his blowpipe. He takes a deep breath and exerts enormous force, with his cheeks bulging out like those of a trumpet player. It's heavy work. People laugh a little because it looks funny. But the third time they no longer laugh because it's inhumane. At the end of the show, I show that man one more time. When he isn't blowing and his cheeks are hanging down, he looks straight into the camera, effectively saying, "Yes, this is me, I make beautiful things." Now that's documentary filmmaking. Then the auditorium is quiet. The next scene can begin right away because the audience is moved. The point you want to make is in the scene after that man. That's how I learned what a director has to do in a film or a play. I learned that on my own. And here is the Philips documentary, largely without words. I'll translate where I can. Man walks out in front of a white screen. Run the Philips film. And this introduces you to the Philips factory and its workers. Transmitting valves. The factory workers on their way to work at Philips. This follows a typical day in the life of the Philips factory. Machine shop with belt drives on all of the lathes. Grinding mills, probably for Bakelite. And the glass blower's shop. Balloon blowing. Notice that they have these glass bulbs on the ends of steel rods, and how they put them into the furnace and return to the blowing position without burning each other is something that leaves me quite amazed. Hand-blown high-power lamps. They have to spin them while they're still hot, and then they blow a bubble, effectively at the end of the rod. By spinning the rod very quickly in their mouths while applying pressure. Joris Ivens turns this into an almost hypnotic sequence, showing great respect for the skill of the glassblower. Notice that the bulbs are actually blown into a mould to keep them the same size. The finished product. Teams of glassblowers at work. There was, of course, for smaller bulbs, a more automatic system. Here's machine glass making, bulb making. Machine production of light bulbs. You'll see radio valves being made shortly.
Hallo, machine 2B, 500 stuks.
Logging the numbers made. measuring out the hot glass and then blowing them into bulbs automatically. With water cooling on the moulds. And look at all of those many thousands of finished bulbs. Philips was making these for a world market at the time. This is, of course, 90 years ago and in the middle of a Great Depression, so it's quite an achievement industrially. Taking a view of the heating for the furnaces and exhaust. The Philips advertising sign and the dispatch department down below. Dispatch was very labour intensive in those days. Hand-pushed trucks, and you'll see an early forerunner of the forklift. Man used to ride on the front of it at that stage, and occasionally came to grief. Fabrication of valve sockets. Here they are receiving their pins. Awaiting their glass bulbs. Mostly 4 or 5 pin, they were either triodes or pentodes at this early stage. You'll notice that the spacing of the pins was irregular on the 4-pin bases. They were different types of base to the American 4-pin base at the time. There's the 5-pin base, quite odd by modern standards. The girls on the valve production line, and there are the valve stems. Crimping machine. And of course at that stage a lot of the work was manual. Crimping the wires to the anode assembly. And that's the guts of the valve with its stem ready for exhaustion and fitting to the bulb itself. She's painting a bit of getter on the bottom. That is to remove the oxygen from the valve when it's heated up by induction heating. There are the bulbs into which those will be fitted. Must have been very repetitive work. This machine is automatically assembling the valve with its base. Or I should say with the stem. And off the valves go up the production line. You'll see a terminal on the side of the base. That was for pentodes. They usually would have 4 pins at the base that were active and 1 on the side for the screen grid. Pentodes were fairly new at that stage in 1931. Checking them for amplification factor and to see that there's no gas in the tube. You'll notice the terminal on the side of the base. And if one valve is good, 1,000 must be better. That is the glass crucible, and these men are fabricating very large glass stems, I believe for transmitting tubes, high-power transmitting tubes, usually water-cooled, which needed massive glass-to-metal seals. They're rolling the semi-molten glass into the right shape and diameter. A lot of this must have been with the judgment of the glassblower rather than using measuring devices. Highly skilled work. Kind of sad to think that it was replaced by machine operation later on. The skilled hands of the glassblower. And heat has to be applied to keep the glass in a semi-molten state, of course. A lot of heat. Fitting a stem. And then stretching the tube out a little. This is the way you make a glass tube. Rapidly rotating a glass cylinder and then stretching it out on a wooden rack. A bit like making toffee, but a bit more risky and a lot more heat's involved. You wonder how many of these guys ended up with emphysema, don't you? Something that's intrigued me is how they never got the hot air from the glass back into their mouths to burn their tongue or their jaw. Notice he takes his face off the tube very quickly. Probably bitter experience involved. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the regular Saturday night test transmission, simultaneous YouTube live stream. We're currently streaming a documentary film, on Philips radio, made at Eindhoven in 1931 by the pioneer documentary filmmaker Joris Ivens. Sorting the glass tubing for the valve making process. Joris Ivens, in his later writings, talks about the way that he found all this industrial process quite hypnotic, and I can understand why, seeing this. Thousands of valve stems. all rattling down into automatic sorted shapes and sizes. Transmitting tube fabrication. And here we see a transmitting valve taking shape. That's the skilled glass blower with the glass crucible with the raw glass at the back there. And he puts the bulb into a form and then spins it rapidly as he applies blowing pressure to blow it into a cylinder of exactly the right size, shape and length, rotating it very rapidly so that it can't cool while he's making it into a perfectly circular shape in the mould. And there it is, at least one end of a transmitting tube. Hot work. And there are, if not hundreds, tens of transmitting tubes taking shape. Now this is forming the glass to metal seal on the copper anode of what's to become a water-cooled transmitting tube. A lot of heat's required to fuse the glass to the metal. I believe the metal was coated with some sort of oxide to aid the attachment process of the glass to the metal. All highly skilled work. And they're heating the copper to red heat at the same time heating the glass. And there's the glass to metal sealed formed. And that's a transmitting tube, anode at the bottom there. Doesn't yet have its vacuum exhausted. A rack full of completed transmitting tubes. There's a smaller one, big enough anode, almost looks like a hurricane lamp. And they take it upstairs for testing, I guess. You can see the filament connections with the two screws on the bottom of each transmitting valve, and this is presumably the test room. And what they're doing there is applying voltage, and that's the mercury pump to provide the vacuum, and they're heating it up to get rid of occluded gases. A 30 kilowatt transmitting station. That was the variable capacitor, the AC to DC rotary converters. There's the transmitting tube about to be tested. Throw the switch, Igor. Clunk. And that is a Philips radio receiver of that time, 1931, with a rocking armature and horn combination loudspeaker on top. Secretarial work. This is presumably the accounts department of Philips. And all the letters from different parts, orders from different parts of the world.
Very truly yours, agree, messieurs. Hochachtend, muy atento, hochachtungsvoll.
In the laboratory. The high voltage testing laboratory. Artificial lightning. A few million volts here. Oh, very nice. This is loudspeaker testing for their polar pattern. You'll notice they're rotating a series of microphones around a rotating speaker and then checking it at different frequencies. They're actually drawing the polar pattern of the loudspeaker to try and make its output more diffuse at every frequency, so you don't have to be sitting in one spot in the room. Interesting that they were actually measuring it at this early stage. And then trying music in it. A test disc. Now those are Philips pickups being tested to see how many operations their pivots will take. Steel needle pickups in those days. And a bit of figuring going on. This is Philips' drafting department. The documentary actually emphasises how broad the activities of Philips were at that time. And remember, this is in the worst year of the worst financial depression of the 20th century, so they were doing extremely well, having this number of skilled employees. Designing the latest types of receiver there. And this is just at the time when receiver design was changing from tuned radio frequency architecture to the superhet. Superhets were available in the 20s, but they weren't terribly good, and generally their IFs were down around 60 kilohertz. They were lousy with image responses, but at this time they were moving the IF up. End of the day siren. I'm sure that their siren didn't sound quite as creepy as that. This is putting the finishing touches on the Philips metal cabinets of their radios and coil screening devices. There's the extensive collection of dust extractors. The assembly of the apparatus. The intertitles, by the way, are in Dutch. Making up a wiring loom that can later be soldered into the radio to connect its various parts. Hundreds of wiring looms, basically made on a wooden form by a teenage girl in this case. And they used the Henry Ford production line technique. There are the chassis going from desk to desk, and each girl is adding a little bit to it or making a new bend in a variable capacitor mounting, in that case a coil mounting. Fitting the TRF coils into the tuning sections of a TRF set. And your soldering iron didn't have to be very small when you were soldering solder tags, please note. Fitting the wire forms into the radio. 3-gang tuning capacitor for a 3-stage TRF set. All shielded. First stage. checking that everything mechanically is right, and putting your imprint on to say this stage is okay. Variable capacitor opens and turns around properly. Second stage of testing. Applying a bit of voltage, just checking that everything is conducting where it should. No shorts. Now fitting into its metal screened case. The Philips radios of those times were very elegant metal devices, as you'll see in a minute when they're finished. Fitting the valves. And checking each stage with a pair of headphones to see that each successive stage is doing its job. Old S.G. Brown style headphones too. Probably high impedance. And off go the assembled receiving chassis. Elegantly finished cover being put on. What one wouldn't give for a Philips radio of that period in that condition today. Moving to the next department. A few floors up, the loudspeaker assemblage. At this stage, Philips hadn't settled on the moving coil loudspeaker. They actually were making rocking armature loudspeakers, as you will see. This is the fabrication of the Bakelite parts under extreme heat and pressure. Bakelite bits, phenolic material, put into the press, and a bit of powder so it doesn't stick to the press. Now a lot of heat and a lot of pressure. Bakelite is electroforming, not thermoplastic. Sorry, thermoforming. How many tons, one wonders? Keep your fingers out of that. The smell of all that hot Bakelite must have been really something, and notice they timed it with an egg timer. Okay, that's enough pressure, that's enough temperature. Let's see what we've got in the press. Crank it out. And there's the mould for a Philips rocking armature loudspeaker mounting. Measuring the right amount of Bakelite for each one. And there's the Bakelite case for one of their speakers. A thing of beauty, even if it couldn't reproduce much below 100 Hertz. Makes vinyl pressing look like child's play. This is really hot, really heavy stuff. And applying a final spray coating. They did have some respect for the safety of their operatives. It appears that at this stage, with the impregnation of the diaphragm for the speaker, the vapours must have been very toxic. It's almost like he's handling radioactive material. Now that, I think, is a pot core from one of their very earliest moving coil speakers. Yes, this is for electrodynamic speakers. Those are the speaker magnets that are going to be fabricated. The other type of speaker they had at that stage. And this is the production line for electrodynamic speakers. They didn't have Alnico magnets at that stage, so they had to energise the speaker with a choke coil on the HT line to provide enough magnetic flux for the moving coil. So permanent magnet loudspeakers were not around at that stage, or at least if they were only very small. Later became standard. The loudspeaker production line at Philips, 1931. All fitting the various parts, the cardboard seals, the moving coil has been fitted with the diaphragm. There's a radio cabinet in Bakelite with the moving coil speaker in the bottom there. Philips logo on the front of it, of course. At about 11:15 we'll be opening for live QSO, by the way. This is VK3AML with a documentary on Philips radio from 1931. It's a documentary without any narration, so I'm having to provide some to make our 2-metre transmission mean something. These are stages in the assembly of rocking armature loudspeakers. There's 7-sided housing for these. They were known as the 7-et loudspeaker, produced from about 1930 to about 1933. This would have been the middle of their production. No moving coil for these. These were driven by a rocking armature movement. And there's the rocking armature movement with the driving pin, and you'll see they're connecting the driving pin to the middle of the cone of the speaker. Tended to be fairly tinny things, these, and they couldn't produce much volume. The moving coil eventually proved to be far, far better, so they took over. These were reasonably high impedance. I think the average impedance of these was about 600 ohms. Way, way higher than the 8 ohm speakers that became standard much later on. And of course that meant that you could put them directly into the anode circuit of an output tube. No output transformer, which was one advantage of the rocking armature speakers. Moving on to the next part of the process, actually testing the speaker. Go over a line where somebody's listening to see if you can hear any rattles from the moving coil or from the rocking armature, as it case may be. So he plays the record through the amplifier and through that speaker, and a series of speakers are going by him and he's listening very carefully. Automatically switch on and off as they go through. So each speaker, if this is to be believed, was ear tested. I've seen some of these in radio collectors' collections, and the multicoloured bakelite in these speakers makes them a very attractive item, even if they weren't very hi-fi by modern standards. The 7-et loudspeaker. Very different principle to modern loudspeakers, please note. Okay, 2 minutes to QSO, people, and then we'll go live. And finally, the dispatch. To all parts of the world. At this stage, Philips radios and valves were being imported into Australia in huge numbers. In the 1930s, government enacted import tariffs on radio equipment, which vastly reduced the input from Philips and from Telefunken, particularly as AWA and Radiola were coming into production locally. And these are the 1931 vintage equivalents of forklift trucks, and here we are throwing the boxes of Philips radios and loudspeakers up onto a boxcar on a train. Presumably Eindhoven had a station right by the factory. The Philips production plant at Eindhoven, and as you can see, the largest production plant for radio in the world at that time. And the 1931 vintage equivalent of forklifts. Just a quick recap on the making of parts, and a little abstract sequence thrown in by Joris Ivens to conclude the film. Dancing loudspeakers. And that concludes the Philips radio sequence. And we're back live, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. I'll be opening up almost immediately on 147.475 for any calls, hoping that tonight's content hasn't been too commercial. It wasn't intended that way. I hope that it gave an overview rather than a specific promotion of any one company, but I tried to get material from as many Australian manufacturers of radios as possible so that I wasn't giving favouritism to any one company or organisation. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. Now going over to 147.475 and calling CQ. Is anybody still listening? I've got no monitoring. I have no monitoring. I don't know why. And I can see why, and there it is. I'll just have to change my connections here. Please stand by. Okay, let's try that again. VK3AML. I hope that's right. Calling CQ and standing by.
VK3ACZ.
Got you, Peter. VK3ACZ, VK3AML. I hope that all came over okay. I was listening on 2 metres. It sounded okay there, and I hope the stream was similar. I hope you saw the flood pictures early on. People north of the ranges are really getting it in the neck, and Neil VK3KAL, I think it was, sent me those pictures this afternoon. Pretty grim times up at Alexandra. VK3ACZ, not yet with group. VK3AML.
And I left a little pause there. VK3AML or VK3ACZ returning. Good evening, Chris. Good evening, listeners. And don't worry about your broadcast being too commercial tonight. No, it was for our edification, so it was all good. First of all, I'd like to comment about the production line and the glass bulbs. Boy, did I have some respect for those glass blowers. Amazing precision they have to have, and absolute wonder that there were no accidents. Had me really impressed, although worried. Come to think of it, it brought back flashbacks of when I was a teenager, around about 15 or 16. I had a school vacation job in a tool room, and I had enjoyed work at school and thought I'll be a tool maker. This school vacation job talked me out of it because I was one little cog in a production line just cutting one particular piece of metal in half so it could fit into another lathe, and it drove me nuts after a few weeks. Wouldn't have lasted the difference in that Phillips factory, that's for sure, but you've got to really highly appreciate them, and it's with a sense of embarrassment that I confess to you that I'd never thought about how either valve glass or ordinary light bulbs are constructed, so it was a real edgification. The guy testing the speakers as they went past, I thought that gave new meaning to the term calibrated eardrum. But anyway, and quickly about the Codan, very impressive little radio system there and demonstration that they made. It certainly made the ICOM 7300 with its little ICOMs look very insignificant by comparison. Oh my goodness, we're going ahead so much in leaps and bounds with technology, it's hard to imagine where it's all going. Anyway, really enjoyed the broadcast tonight, of course, as everybody else would, and see you're getting quite a following now. It was good reading the comments of some of the people. VK3BA, hello there, Big Nick. Good to have you on board. Although he's mentioned you on Sean 3KK's round table net on 70 centimetres on Wednesday night, so you're getting a bit of publicity from a few people, which is good to hear. Anyway, back to you. Hope Dave's going to join us. I saw Dave in the chat before, so he should be on as well. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ, it seems that nobody else is joining us so far. It's interesting. I'm looking at the graph of people watching, and they peaked during the Phillips documentary, and the simultaneous number of viewers peaked at 32, which is higher than I've ever had before on this YouTube live stream. So we must be doing something right. Ian Foster, 3ST. Hello, Ian. Nice to see you there. He says he didn't hear about Australian antenna manufacturers billing Lee, whose main staff went on to start Scalar and was eventually sold to ZCG Scalar Antennae. I'll have to look into that. I know that there were a few antenna companies I didn't cover. One of them was AntSig. I don't know whether they still go, but they used to be very large in television antenna manufacturers. Ian goes on, I was associated with the startup of Scalar and spent over 25 years contract design for my friend Gregor Cox, VK3ZXG. ZCG now incorporated NBS antenna from Swan Reach. I celebrated on 13th October 1995 with Gregor before Gregor passed away, and the company went to his son, Ray Cox. They have now taken on NBS ex Swan Reach. And VK3BA says, Ian, I wasn't aware of the NBS change, but have now found them at Lindenow as well. Thanks. So, yeah, there is still some manufacture going on in spite of the fact that all of the tariffs came off at the time, the mid-70s, during Whitlam's time. But there have been some notable survivals. And interestingly, Peter, with the modern software-defined transceivers that we saw, both in the case of the Perth firm and Codan, they're making their transceivers fully integrated with the internet and with the public telephone service, so that the transceiver can be used for sending emails, pictures, text or voice, as the case may be. It's no longer a world where we're just using radio on HF as a telephone. And of course, once it's digitised, it can be encrypted in any one of a number of different ways. I believe that one of those two firms, I think it was Codan, has a system that can be doubly encrypted, and fairly obviously that's aimed at organisations like the military. But how far ahead of anything in the amateur field must that be? A radio that's sufficiently intelligent that it can find its own base station, and then the base station can tell the radio which frequency to go to for the best the best propagation. Mind you, you pay for it. I looked at the price of those radios, and they're not what you would call amateur in price. But nevertheless, very interesting to see where eventually ham radio might go. Tom George, nice to see you there. And thank you for the compliment, VK3BA also. Let's see if we can rattle up anybody else on VHF. This is VK3AML standing by for Peter VK3ACZ with a pause if anybody else would like to break in.
VK3HAG.
That sounded like VK3HAG. Would you like to take it? I must get the name too. I think I should know.
VK3AML, VK3HAG. Name is Ashley. Yeah, I was listening to, I'm not sure if it was yourself or your peers or colleagues from the old crossband mission days when you gentlemen, or you're either part of or following in their footsteps that used to do the crossband missions on, I believe there's a shortwave station now that's moved on to that. That was, I think, VK3ASE it might have been, without looking at the computer while I've got the microphone in hand. And many years ago came across that while I was still a SWL, and that kind of got me hooked on these kind of broadcasts and listening in. And some of the jokes that you gentlemen had, such as ensuring that your carrier was modulated, carrying technical information of interest to hams and all that kind of stuff. And that'd be 15, 20 years ago now to had a pretty good guess. VK3AML, VK3HAG.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. VK3HAG, VK3AML. Well, it would be more than that. Tony left crossbanding when he married Anna Sanderson, who we still see, one of my wife's best friends, and he married Anna in 1981. So all of the activity from Tony's that was crossbanding, in which I was involved, was between 1969 and 1981. Now, 41 years plus ago. I'm 68. If you do your sums, you'll find that that was that period that I was on there spanned the time I was 15 to about the age of 26. So I'm a lot older now. And I'm not sure that I like hearing the tapes of myself from that time. You've probably heard quite a few of them. Dave, the replays that you probably heard were not live, but Dave kept playing the tapes of those as test material from when Tony signed off in 81 right through to about 5 years ago. So in many cases what you were hearing was material up to 50 years old, with me up to 50 years younger. And that can be embarrassing. Now Dave, he tired of doing crossbands after 45 plus years and decided to go for a shortwave license, as you rightly imply. And he now has two frequencies, 4835 kilohertz, 4835 kilohertz, and 2310 kilohertz. At the moment, he's got the most power and the best output on 4835, and I believe most days starts transmissions there at 3 p.m. and finishes about 10, though it varies. But he has some interesting material on there, and he's one of the few shortwave stations I know to recognise that his listenership will be specialist with specialist interests. Most of the other shortwave stations now are either foreign language, Chinese typically, the Chinese are still using shortwave quite a bit, or they're holy roller right-wing Christian stations from the US where they think they're converting the heathen of the world to their way of fundamentalism. And if they can do it, good on them. But Dave was very against the closure of Radio Australia, had a personal run-in with Michelle Guthrie over the situation in the ABC, and subsequently went to ACMA and simply asked what's happened to the ABC's or other Radio Australia's transmitting frequencies. Are they available, and can I buy a licence for them? And apparently was charged about $100 for 4 months. So hopefully he makes a go of it. It'll take a lot of personal input to do it. He's trying to make his station automated so he doesn't actually have to be there to put all of the material on. But I wish him luck. I have heard on a certain band, a certain coffee break session, really tearing him to shreds, having not one positive thing to say about what he's doing. And personally, I think that those blokes should hang their heads in shame, because he's achieved 10 times what they ever will. VK3ACZ to take it, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, and now group.
And VK3ECG.
There's Dave. Dave has arrived. Good evening to Dave. I'll just check I'm not doubling. Yeah, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. And the thought came to my mind when you said that about the opposition to the new Radio Australia is Whiskey Tango Fox. That's all I could think. There must be some people who just enjoy a good teardown. That's all I can say. I'm full of admiration for him for getting those two frequencies and doing something with them, and something we can listen to, which is eventually for our own entertainment. So why anybody would object to that is another story. Anyway, enough of that. Sorry, I was just taken by surprise. But one thing I did miss, Chris, and it's a primary school question really, but getting vacuums into the valve stems and the construction of the valve stems and the light globes. You said something about change of temperature or heating. Can you explain what the actual process is that makes light bulbs into a vacuum? And good that you came along to join us, Dave. Things are back to normal. I can cope again. Hi. VK3AML in the group. VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ group, VK3AML. Probably somebody like Ian Foster, 3ST, could explain the process better. But as I understand it, having seen a lot of documentary films on the making of valves, the valve had a reactive metal put into the base somewhere, or sometimes sprayed onto the inside of the glass in such a way that when the vacuum was created, whatever other oxygen atoms or reactive atoms were in the atmosphere in the bulb would react with the magnesium, whatever it was, on the surface, the inside surface of the valve, to remove them from circulation, from affecting the vacuum. But at the time that Phillips documentary was made, you could actually see a mercury pump. They had a thing called a Springle pump very early on, where they would pour mercury down a tube, and it would actually would catch the with a certain sort of an arrangement of glass tubing, it would catch bubbles of the air and gradually drag the vacuum out of the tubes. Early in that Phillips documentary, you also saw some double-acting vacuum pumps going, which I suspect were also involved with that. But making a valve doesn't just involve pumping the air out and firing it up. There's a process called induction heating. Usually they put the valve into a big coil made of gas pipe, and they energise it with several hundred watts of RF and make all of the internal components glow red hot. And the idea of that, while drawing the remaining atmosphere out of the bulb through the stem, the idea of that was a certain amount of gas, nitrogen, oxygen, is occluded or actually dissolved into the metal parts. It's not oxygen, it's not an oxide. There's actually oxygen that's sitting inside the molecules of the of the metal parts in the valve, occluded gas, and you can only get rid of it by heating the internals, the parts inside the valve, the anode, the cathode, etc., while the air is being extracted. And that's the part that many people miss. Give you a story related to that. When I was about 17, the Museum of Victoria was trying to make up a demonstration model of a mechanical television scanner. Gil Miles, VK3KAL, who had made one of those in 1928 as an engineer working for TRL in St Kilda Road, the first working television scanner in Australia, I might add. This is 94 years ago. In those days, they would view a modulated neon lamp through the holes of a spinning, what they call a Nipkow scanning disc. You couldn't use a filament lamp as your modulated light source because it couldn't heat up and cool down fast enough to reproduce the video modulation. A neon lamp could. So you would have a neon lamp with a little square of nickel in an evacuated bulb with neon in it at a very low pressure. The square would be a cathode, and the neon glow would appear over the cathode, usually a mirror-faced cathode, so you'd double the amount of light output coming forward, and the neon cathode was about 1.5 inches square inside the bulb. Now, in 1971, the curator of the Museum of Victoria for Electronics and Radio was... I'm just trying to think of his name. I can see his face in my memory, and I ran into him recently in his late 80s, still alive. He approached Claude Neon to have them make a reproduction television neon of the late 1920s. Claude Neon, who do the neon signs, or used to. So they debased an old Phillips valve, a QQVO 640, which was the right kind of size and shape. So I've got one up here, actually. Whoops. I can actually show you the valve that they reconstructed to make one of these neon lamps. That's a QQVO 640. Phillips valve. Double tetrode, I think, basically, for VHF. And they put a nickel plate in there and a couple of wires for the anode. Took all the air out, put a bit of neon in, fired it up. It worked beautifully for 20 minutes. And then the heat of the neon discharge inside the tube was sufficient to drive the occluded gas in the nickel cathode plate out into the discharge and spoil the discharge. The striking voltage of the neon lamp went up and up and up until it wouldn't strike anymore. So it just goes to prove, for a valve to be effective, it's not just a matter of putting the metal parts in and creating a vacuum. You have to induction heat the components inside to drive out the occluded gas, and that's a major important part of valve manufacture that many modern people attempting it actually miss. Sorry, I'm deviating wildly. VK3ECG, hello Dave, how's your week been? I hope you don't have any friends who have been affected by the floods. VK3ECG and group, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group, VK3ECG. Yes, fine there, Chris, and thank you very much for tonight. Fascinating stuff watching, and it really was incredibly artistic. I can see what the person meant, the filmmaker, in relation to the Philips. It was a wonderful example, I suppose, of scientific and industrial manufacture actually having quite a sort of an artistic, sort of rhythmic feel to the images. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I'm sorry to say that I was sitting there and I'd moved from my desk chair into my armchair, and I actually nodded off and woke to find you'd already started the talkback, so I have to apologise for that. No, it's been an interesting week, and yes, I had one friend who has moved up to the sort of the General Bendigo area, and so some of those photographs you showed at the beginning, he showed me something fairly similar the other day when of the trees down by hit the bridge on his driveway. Effectively, his driveway goes over a river, and the tree was straight across the driveway and so on. He's actually managed to get his gold license for his own property and so on, and of course what's happened is that he's actually now finding all kinds of interesting bits of gold, because of course it's all the soil and the small stones have been swept away, so it's actually become quite interesting. So he's looking at that, but fortunately he isn't significantly affected by the actual flooding as such. But obviously it's still a fairly difficult environment to be living in. And he's probably more lucky than most. I must admit, one thing that did catch my eye as I watched the Rakophone factory was the cadmium plating of everything. Of course, really quite useful stuff, cadmium plating, because it's really good against corrosion and things like that. But of course, it's incredibly toxic, and they used cyanide baths and things like this to plate the stuff with cadmium. So watching people dipping stuff in and walking around, considering there was cyanide and cadmium oxide and so on, and incredibly carcinogenic stuff actually. So again, another interesting example of I wonder what happened to some of the people working in some of those areas over the years, and so on. Fortunately, the low levels in the environment don't seem to have the same effect, thank goodness, but I'm sure lots of people have issues about it. Anyway, I would also mention that, asking how Prue is. I gather she wasn't so well during the week, and I hope all is better now, as it were. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML and Group VK3CG.
VK3CG and Group VK3AML. I've just tried to open Zoom on the other computer, and it won't let me. I've fed the passcode in, and I will have to say no Zoom this week, fellas. I'm sorry, particularly to Rolly over in New Zealand, but for some strange reason I'm going to have to sit down and completely sort out a new Zoom account. I'm almost inclined to use Skype instead. Zoom is a complete P in the A if you don't pay for it. With regard to Prue, not good. In addition to all her other problems, she now has a tummy bug, which means that she's been able to eat very little over the last 4 days, and she has lost something like 2 kilos. I'm trying to keep electrolytes and liquid up to her. We've had her to the doctor 2 days. She's been for scans, and she's not doing well at all. And that's one of the reasons I haven't spent so much time this week in preparing. I had intended actually to do a special tonight on the amateurs of Southland in New Zealand. I know one in particular, Mike, who lives in Invercargill, who has supplied a lot of information on 3 aspects of Invercargill. Being so far south, they have all sorts of specialist facilities there. They're effectively 450 kilometres south of Hobart in latitude. They're at almost latitude 47 south. So there they have the Awarua Radio Museum at the old ship-to-shore long-wave station, which used to be called ZLB. One of the best radio museums I've seen anywhere in Australasia, and Mike's the secretary of that organisation. They have what they call the Unwin radar, which is an over-the-horizon radar pointed south towards the South Pole, which works in with a similar radar system between Lunawanna and Cloudy Bay on Bruny Island in Tasmania, of all places. So yes, we have two sets of over-the-horizon radar in Australia, the well-known one pointing northwest from central Australia, and a very poorly known one pointing south from both Bruny Island and Invercargill. And I'll say a lot about that next week with Mike's help. We actually have located the Bruny Island one on Google Earth, and it's quite an installation. Series of about 20 log periodic arrays pointed south that are in two lines, and working between Bruny Island and Invercargill, they can produce a beam that's 4 degrees wide on about 10 megahertz. So that's really some system. They use it for auroral propagation research and ionospheric propagation research, but I've no doubt that they don't say much about it, but it can also be used for observation of aerial and ship traffic in the Southern Ocean. Quite capable of that. And the Bureau of Meteorology uses the radar to work out what the sea state is south of Australia, the wave height, the wave direction, all that sort of stuff. And so there are some interesting facilities of which people know very little, and I hope to inform people of that with Mike's help, Mike ZL4OM, next week. I actually have recorded a half-hour interview with him on Skype on Thursday, and I'll be doing another one before we finish, and integrating that with various other bits of documentary material that I have shot in Invercargill and other people have. Should make a very interesting episode next week. Sorry to hear that we made you nod off, Dave, but there are certain hypnotic parts of that Phillips documentary that it's like travelling down a long highway with the dotted line going on, off, on, off, on, off in front of your car. It can become hypnotic. So I'll hand it round to Ashley, VK3HA. Is it HA Golf or HA Delta? VK3HAG, I'll say VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, if you're still there.
VK8. VK3 Hotel Alpha Golf, I'll just pause for a moment to let the other station be acknowledged. VK3AML, VK3HAG.
Yes, I've got you there, Mr. Egg. We'll bring you in after Ashley.
Yeah, I won't stay for long. I'm going to head QSY horizontal in a minute. I just wanted to comment on, after our early conversation, yes, that now I can put all the little pieces of the jigsaw puzzles from old logbooks and information that I have together of what I had and the recordings, and that are obviously rebroadcasts of earlier information. But I certainly did, for example, I'm a journo these days by trade, but some of those downloads, for example, in the old dial-up days, I used for a bit of learning and listening to things such as Pepsodent Presents Sunday night at 8 and things like that, to listen to some of the old-time broadcasts and how radio broadcasting used to be done when it, in my opinion, was much more professional than many of people in my trade are today. And also that, for example, that, yeah, I agree completely, not just for us in Australia, that closing down Radio Australia seems pretty silly to me, specifically given all of our Pacific neighbours and those countries where they don't all have the internet, and we haven't gone there, and our government hasn't built them the NBN network or anything like that for a lot of these people. There's still people living in villages and things like that, and now how do they access information from our country? They don't. And I'm sure that countries like China are quite happy to fill the gap. When, worst case scenario, they could have kept the transmitters on and used them a few hours a day for international programming, and just then given them a feed of 3LO or QSB or news radio or something like that for the intermittent bits, and if they didn't have the programming. Especially given that you told me the cost of the transmitter licenses was only a couple $100. Well, I'm sure that the ABC can find money for other things in their budget. They could have easily found the money to keep those licences and the transmitters on the air. VK3AML, VK3HAG is clear. Thank you for a lovely broadcast and listening for a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I tend to agree with you. Purely from the point of view of budget, I don't see that it was a huge amount out of the ABC's budget. But there is a worldwide trend to closing down national broadcasters, at least from the point of view of HF radio. I mean, there are, in most cases, there are better ways of delivering radio these days, and FM, internet, and contrary to what you say, I mean, I've been surprised that even villages in places like Timor and the back blocks of Indonesia now have a communal satellite antenna and internet for the sake of educating their kids. There are very few places in the Pacific that are not served in some way, and if as we've dropped it, I believe Radio New Zealand International, RNZI, HF, has taken over, and of course they are more a part of the Pacific cultural scene, probably, than we are. But I agree that from a financial point of view, it was no skin off Michelle Guthrie's nose to keep it going. She obviously had some rationale. I'm not sure that she would have publicised it, but Dave apparently tore strips off her at a meeting, and his acquiring of 2 of the frequencies, apparently the ACMA cannot get rid of HF transmitting frequencies. Nobody wants them anymore, and there are very few shortwave receivers actually in production. Plenty of ham rigs, of course, some of which cover the shortwave bands. So round to John, VK3EGG. Welcome, John, and have you any comments, VK3AML?
Yeah, 3AML, VK3EGG. Yeah, we've gone back to not being able to watch your video live on the internet again. I don't know why. Since you've changed to whatever you've changed to, it's not possible. We're going to look up the ones from a month or so ago. Yes, Radio Australia. Well, one of the big things was, of course, we had the people way inland in the cattle stations and that, and their only radio they could listen to in their four-wheel drives during the day doing their work was, of course, HF shortwave, because they're out of range of FM and in the daytime, probably AM, and of course all of a sudden they couldn't get a service they could listen to, and I think someone suggested they put satellite dishes on the top of their four-wheel drives. Well, hang on, I can hardly imagine getting a satellite dish to keep pointing at a satellite on a four-wheel drive while it's going over unsurfaced ground and bumping up and down 2 or 3 feet over every bump every metre like it might. Yeah. Yes, and vowels. Well, I heard the audio of that. Well, actually, some vowels don't have a getter because things like 100 THs and I think 640s are in the same category, use tantalum for the anode. And of course, tantalum anodes are actually self-gettering, if you look it up, which is all quite interesting. Yes, and something else I was going to comment on. Yeah, it all sounded very interesting, but I won't stay on for very long, but I just thought I'd come up and make a few comments about things like that. Anyway, I'll put it by for the moment.
No worries, John. Thanks for popping on. I can't imagine... I've changed nothing here. We still are using the perfectly standard YouTube live stream we've always used. It has improved in service somewhat since the start of last year, when we complained about the NBN service we were getting, which was allowing me to maintain a stream only for about 10 or 15 minutes before it dropped. And it we actually proved to have an NBN connection that was faulty, defective, not properly terminated. That's been fixed. We've never had any problems with drop frames since, and no drop frames tonight. And so far as I know, Dave and Ashley and Peter have been looking in okay. So I don't know what it is, John. It may be the operating system of your viewing device. It may be that you're looking in on a mobile phone of some kind. I don't know, but it's not universally a problem. Back to Peter, VK3ACZ and Group, VK3AML.
I was looking on an Android phone, and it's a fairly new one.
Ah, I have heard of other people having trouble with Android phones. Yes, that's the problem.
Well, it's a lot newer than a computer with Windows XP.
Yeah, well, I'm using Windows 7. VK3ACZ and Group, VK3AML.
VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. And Chris, I was sorry to hear that Prue hasn't improved, or she's had a bit of a setback. Best wishes go out to both of you as far as that's concerned. Yeah, a 96-year-old lady that I'm a part-time carer for, she went into hospital with pneumonia too this week. I'm so glad they're actually treating her. Dave will know. Dave will know what I mean by that there. But, yeah, I see there's a couple of silent key notifications on the chat too. I don't know either of them, that you probably will. Radio Australia, yeah, well, my happiest memory was taking a shortwave radio with me in my travels around the world. I never actually heard Radio Australia in Europe at any time for love nor money trying. But it was a wonderful time I had sitting on my balcony in my hotel room in Hawaii, Waikiki, and looking out across the ocean, listening to Radio Australia and feeling like I was connected to home. I don't think I'd get quite the same impression coming through the Wi-Fi of the hotel's own communication system, but there you go. And one other comment, you said a worldwide trend to get rid of it, well, except with China, it seems, Chris. If you notice 40 metres at night, well, I think it's 41 metres, or is it 39? Whatever it is, it's just awash with Chinese signals after dark, and the Australian broadcasts are so full of propaganda that we are the best country in the world and you need to catch up with us and all that sort of stuff. It's shamefully disgusting, almost very unpalatable, hard to listen to. Now, if I were a Mandarin-speaking person in Australia, I suppose I would find that very comforting, but I do take some pleasure in listening to RN Radio New Zealand International. At least they're with us and doing some good broadcasting from time to time too. You'll recall that last week I had a new Yaesu 710 followed me home from the toy shop, Chris. I've spent the week trying to evaluate it and see how it compares to my 7300, because as I think I've said before, the 710 is Yaesu's attempt to answer a question that nobody has asked, or try to catch up on the mileage that ICOM have got from the 7300, which is a very user-friendly radio and very easy to follow with its menu system. Anyway, I had it's been a good week for DX, despite the fact that the solar flux has dropped today down to as low as 109. Contacts with, I forgot to set the timer back, contacts with France, Germany and Finland tonight on 10 metres, which was very, very nice. I had a QSO with somebody in Canterbury, England this afternoon on 20 metres, and it was like having a conversation on the local FM repeater. It was just so crystal clear and magnificent. But anyway, I see one other thing I wrote down about your previous comments is I found the Philips Doco too fascinating to be hypnotic, Chris. So there you go. Back to you, VK3AML and the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that the Yaesu 710's working out. And you're right, as you tune across the shortwave bands, particularly 15 metres, 20 metres, 25, 31 metres, just Chinese calls, Chinese stations predominate on each of those bands. And on a lot of them, it's the same program. You just hear the same voice as you tune across. I wish I had Mandarin to know what's going on. It does mean that if we were trying to get our picture of our society out to people in China, perhaps if they'd maintained Radio Australia, people listening in China might get some impression of our country. Now, somebody on the net has just pointed out that Rodney Champness, VK3UG, is now listed as a silent key. He was a good writer on early radio equipment for Electronics Australia, I think, as well as other magazines. I never got on with him, I must say. He was in the department when I was in my teens and was rather overzealous, in my opinion, particularly with the pursuit of young teenagers just having fun with 100 milliwatts and an oscillator, which is what I was in 1968. One that gives me particular regret on the silent keys list this week, I don't know whether anybody's confirmed this, but I did hear that Alan VK3SLR, who I think also had the call sign VK3 Bravo Victor, prominent in the D-Star group in Melbourne, passed away just in the last 48 hours or so. Alan VK3SLR, if anybody knew him. I think he was living down Hallam Way or Warrigal or somewhere down that way. Didn't hear a great deal of him on the analogue channels, but apparently he was frequently on digital. He had problems with his sight. I know that it was an ongoing problem. VK3UG. VK3WL is saying that he spoke with him only some 6 weeks ago about an article he's written for AR that will be published about Radio Australia. Tom George, I was known to 3UG back about 1970 for all the wrong reasons. Story again. As a young man, I was naturally attracted to ringing up ham radio operators that I could hear on either the crystal sets or the regenerative receivers or the, in some cases, super regenerative receivers for VHF where I could pick them up. And one of the first young men that I heard on 160 metres was the late Dan Van Elken, VK3 Uniform India, who was only 18 months older than I in 1969. He would have been then 17, I was 15. And I built a one-valve oscillator for 160 metres, and I added a modulator to the anode of it, which could produce very distorted audio, but it did get out. And he was only a mile and a half away, near the corner of Glenferrie and Riversdale Road, Hawthorne. So I called him, and he invited me over to see how his shack was run. And Dan and I struck up a friendship. I went round there on my bicycle. It's a long time ago. And Dan had, even at the age of 17, had built most of his equipment, most of it valve. I remember the transmitter was what was called a clamp tube modulated, series modulated AM transmitter on 160 metres. And he had also built a very large corner enclosure for a high-class roller twin cone speaker with a vented enclosure, producing extremely good reproduction of the modulation generated about 5 miles away by the late Tony Sanderson, who just happened to be VK3AML. And Dan introduced me to Tony. But when I first went round to Dan's place and opened the front door on his place, he said to me, "Chris, nice to meet you. I've got good news and bad news." I said, "What's the good news?" He said, "The good news is I was getting you with a very good signal, and it's very nice to meet you. The bad news is that a member of the department was also listening and has told you that if you do not cease and desist. He will cause trouble for you, and his name is Rodney Champness, VK3UG. Okay. I wondered who the guy was at the end of the street, peering down into our street and looking at me as I was walking around the front yard with a transistor radio, obviously listening to where my signals were getting out to. But I must say it did at the time seem like unnecessary harassment. It wasn't as if I was blotting a major band. He had a job to do, Chris. Well, maybe he did, but this was out of hours, and how can I put this? The department, when they, as I understand it, and this has happened a couple of times, the department gets sometimes people who are overzealous in their job. And when they're overzealous, they create more than enough work for their department. And frequently what the department does to deal with that overzealousness is to transfer them to a bush posting. And I'm not going to say any more. Read between the lines. What else can I say? Well, Alan 3SLR is a sad departure, and I just wonder if any of you have heard of him. I'll hand it round to Dave, VK3CG and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3ECG returning. Good evening, everyone. I don't think I've spoken to Ashley before, but and good evening and good night to John. Yes, no, I probably didn't know the people because, of course, I wasn't really in Melbourne in those sort of early days, being a latecomer, as it were. And I know what you mean. I mean, I remember certainly issues in the UK and all, indeed, nothing to do with sort of the amateur radio side, but even the license detecting bands and things like that going around the streets. And, of course, you still have the TV license in the UK and still pay for it. So it's interesting. I'm glad to see and slightly surprised to see that Windows 7 is still working for you. Several people say it was just about the worst version of Windows ever, and XP was a lot better. But no, I've moved on from 7, and the only trouble these days, of course, is there's no real support now for 7. Mind you, that may be a good thing if you have a stable system. But I think they had some security issues as well, but there were a few major organisations around Melbourne that had to move off 7 at great expense, and that included some major hospitals and places like that that really should have been keeping up a little bit with the new systems, given the importance of their IT environment, as it were. Yes, I mean, I was interesting you talk about. You mentioned about the glass blowers and blowing and emphysema and so on. Actually, I don't think they did really. There was no great issue really with glass blowing. Strange enough, it wasn't the glass blowing side. I think they were exposed to nasty things in some of the dyes and oxides and stuff that were used to colour some of the glasses in glass blowing, and although people would say, oh, you'd cook your lungs if you breathe in, the reality was if you did draw the air in, it would be basically what was in the tube, and it would get plugged up by the glass very, very quickly. So I think there's no real problem like that. But I think it's all those secondary chemicals. There's lots of asbestos around and lots of weird oxides around and things like that. But yes, and John's issue at tantalum was interesting as well, because that did used to was used, wasn't it, to capture oxides and things like that. So yes, another one of those useful rare elements that had their particular place at a particular time, and used for very different things now. I've been mucking around a little bit trying to understand this FTM 300 and had to go with getting the software sorted out for APRS and configuring the radio for that, which was quite fun to do, and had to go trying to see what activities around on the fusion side. Not much from what I could see, but I was certainly able to get into the local kangaroo ground, which was repeater, which was good, and worked VK3BYY, of course, who's listened to the transmissions a few times, and I think they're waiting to get the repeater connected up to the internet as well, and then I suppose they'll be able to set up all the sort of fusion wires and stuff like that as well. But certainly able to get the repeater firing up on fusion, which is quite fun. As I said, Peter, we must have a fusion contact and just see, or C4 FM contact and see on simplex and just and see what it's like. It's a very different sound, but there we are. I'm going to, at some stage, to replace the antenna. I wonder how your antenna's going there, Chris. My Codan is still one of the older ones and quite short, and it's actually below part of my roof line, so it doesn't give me the world's greatest receptions. So I'll have to see how that goes. But I don't think Sally wants me walking on the roof.
I think we've lost you, Dave.
Oh, sorry. I think I've got like Peter. I've got to sort out my timeout.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, the antenna here is status quo. One of the guys has snapped. Part of what remains of it has tangled around a ground plane extension of the Diamond X7000. The inverted L antenna support rope has tangled around another ground plane radial from the X7000, and the feed line, which is RG213, is aging. The whole thing has to come down, but I am inclined to hire a handyman younger than self to come in and do it, because I could easily get killed if I fall off the ladder, and it probably needs somebody properly equipped with a safety harness and with a fair bit of strength in the arm that I probably don't have, to push the steel mast up again, locking it periodically as you push up another foot or so. It's a telescoping steel mast, 2 sections of water pipe, 1 1/4 inch water pipe inside a 1 3/4, 2 inch water pipe, I think. Very sturdy, anchored at the 15-foot level on the eave of the roof, so that it doesn't really need guys, but I like to have them there just in case we have one of those 1 in a century hurricanes or something. But at the moment it's been up there 7 years, it's no trouble. But I want to get back into HF, and specifically I would like to extend the coverage that I'm currently putting out on 475 on Saturday nights to something on the top end of 80 metres for those who are interstate, possibly in New Zealand as well. But I'm determined to do it with broadband sideband, extended bandwidth SSB, not AM, because I want to reduce the amount of distortion from potential multipath selective fade. So who do we go round to now? I think we'll see if John 3GG is there. If not, we'll go back to Peter 3ACZ. Are you with us still, John? VK3GG and group VK3AML.
Yes, 3AML, VK3EGG. Yes, the trouble with this rather than crossband is by the time it comes round you've forgotten what you're going to say. Yes, Rodney Champers, well, He seemed quite approachable and reasonable to talk to in Shepparton Hamfest. That's where I used to meet him, and he's a member of the HRSA. In fact, I was saving up to buy some things he has advertised in wireless waves, but obviously that's not going to be much of a go now, because he took over from another guy who had an electronics business in Baronia who died with certain things, and he was now providing them, and we'll have to see what happens. Yes. Oh yeah, the other thing I was going to comment on was Dave's thing. I find here with the PK loops, tenors outside on the roof of this house, that the 2310 service of Dave comes through a lot more consistently than the 4835. I must say I don't tune in till about 9 o'clock at night, but anyway, I found that sometimes the 4835 comes through really well, but the 2310 is the most reliable here. What else? Yes, I covered tantalum anodes. Oh, the other thing about the tantalum anodes, why Ethel McCulloch or whoever it was used them for 100 THs and whatever, is you could run the valves glowing white hot. And in the early days of radar, they made 6 valve ring oscillators and pulsed the 100 THs to put out 15 or 20 kilowatts or more on 220 megs. Did see a lot of our VHF bands are actually what were radar bands during World War II. I might add to that one, I think we should have 220 megs because we adopt everything else America does. In fact, often what we do is we adopt the bad things America does without adopting the good things. But anyway, let's see what else. Yeah, I don't think I ever had the misfortune of meeting Uncle Ugg back in the 70s, but and I don't think Mr. Silvers was all that nice if you were doing missions he didn't approve of when he turned up to your place either. And he got Parkinson or something and died quite some time ago. Yes, I was wondering what happened to Uncle Ugg, because I heard in the radio club meeting the other day that he was ill. And then I guess if he got flooded out on top of that, it might have pushed him over the edge, because Marupna and Shepparton, although it might be less than half the price of a house up there to buy a house twice as big as what you can buy in Melbourne, unless you could get it put on stilts maybe 20 feet up in the air, and also have an elevated ramp that you could drive your car up on that was 20 feet up in the air and stable and all rest underwater currents, well, it doesn't sound much of a proposition. Anyway, there was something else I was trying to remember to say, and I've forgotten it again, so I'll put it by to whoever it is to take it next. VK3 EGG, bye.
Yeah, I'll pick it up. I won't make any further comment on Rodney, except that I met him on several occasions, and it wasn't a happy meeting on any of them. There are several types of amateurs involved with amateur radio. Those who experiment, and I'm thinking of, well, Rodney would be one of those, along with Drew Diamond, Peter Parker, VK3YE, and my predecessor with my call, VK3AML, who were also always into the experimental side of radio in one way or another. But there is a form of thinking that goes with some people that rigidly they think in terms of the old Wireless Telegraphy Act. Thou shalt not broadcast. Thou shalt not do anything that's not absolutely specified by the Act. I mean, the Act now does not ban music. It bans entertainment. But how you define entertainment, I'm not sure, except that I've run these Saturday night transmissions past a member of the department, and I think his quote was, as long as you keep it relevant to the subject in hand, which I try to do, it's more instructional. So I keep it that way. There was one particular amateur, not Rodney, who of recent times actually has said, don't, to another amateur I know, don't do anything the way Chris Long 3AML does it. It's totally illegal. He shouldn't be broadcasting. And this amateur just has, how can I put it, a rigid idea of what amateur radio should be. I mean, I like to push the limits on ham radio. That's why I'm involved with the Thursday night EasyPal group, which is not just digital slow scan. We transfer files. We're trying to find ways at the moment of compressing pictures more by using odd picture codecs like the AVIF codec rather than JPEG-2, and using programs like EasyDRM rather than EasyPal, which is capable, with a slight increase of bandwidth to 5 kilohertz, of transferring much higher baud rates than EasyPal. And there is always some other grundy out there who will be saying, it's illegal, you shouldn't be doing that because it hasn't been done before. Well, frankly, I like doing things because they haven't been done before, such as light beam communication, such as digital communication of slow scan television, and trying to push the limits of that. So, for the same reason that I took on the Saturday night transmissions, initially I did this because we were all locked down. There was a curfew. And the only way I could communicate with people was to do it the way Dave had done it, to have a regular time on Saturday nights and to try and get a conversation going by putting 90 minutes worth of material on a given subject. And tonight's subject has been local manufacture of radio gear. And that provides some means of reviving the good old-fashioned art of rag chewing, which I see in decline everywhere in ham radio at the moment, perhaps with the exception of the digital modes where people can speak across the world. I'm very glad to see people like Peter keeping it going on HF, Peter3ACZ, to whom I will hand it, VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML.
Yeah, well, the raison d'etre of amateur radio is self-education and experimentation in the radio communication arts. So how can anyone tell you, seeing that amateur radio is many things to many people, what you can and can't do with it?
Yeah, very true. Anyway, over to Peter, 3ACZ, 3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ. And Chris, I want to publicly, well, there are people listening, I want to publicly acknowledge what your broadcast did for me during the curfew. I really didn't enjoy that. I mean, I'm sure I've stated that before, but I've probably not given you a debt of thanks and publicly acknowledged what those broadcasts did for me. I had a lot of difficulty with being locked in at night. Didn't really enjoy it. Not only did I not quite see the point in it, and that's, please allow me to have my own personal view on that, but like going for a walk at 10 o'clock at night by myself, I didn't think would cause a pandemic outbreak of the worst possible kind, yet the constabulary were there and would book me if I did so. It was absolutely vital to me to have something to look forward to on a Saturday night, and you never failed to deliver with some really good stuff. I remember hearing Thomas Edison's voice for the first time. Goodness me, I even heard Florence Nightingale's voice for the first time, and all through your cylinder recordings. So you've got a really impressive role to play in the whole ham thing, and if anybody criticises you for that, we should really involve them with sex and travel, I think, or they should be told something like that, or told take a long walk off a short pier. But anyway, just something else to tell you that might come as a surprise, Chris. The slow scan on RML on Thursday nights, sometimes I find myself listening to it and I quite enjoy it. Now, I don't have the decoding possibilities there. Sometimes you all describe your images enough that I can use my imagination and get some sort of an idea. But the funny thing is, I don't find the tones sent out as odd as they might be, all that annoying. and worth it for the description that comes back from the various people afterwards. So I don't know that you'd have too many people listening without an intention of looking at the pictures, but I'm one of those. Anyway, enough of the silliness. And Dave, 3ECG, it'd be good to make a system confusion contact with you. Somebody labelled it that the other day, and I thought that was rather cute, a little bit like the antenna called a station disaster. Forgive me, I like taking on silly names like that. But yes, I see you found RMH up there at Kangaroo Ground, Dave. That's a good one. The only thing I find really surprising is when I hear a simplex QSO on system confusion is have to get used to seeing the call sign flashing up on the screen all the time. That would stop a few people causing difficulties if that was always the case, wouldn't it? But otherwise, yeah, when I've done system fusion, I've usually hooked into the toy shop's node on 439.125, and I've connected with CQ Island and a few other things, and it doesn't really, for me, have quite that same feel of amateur radio. I don't know what it is. There's something about refracting signals off the ionosphere and all the bounces to get across the other side of the world that make it so much more special. And obviously the same with using my phone on Echolink. But anyway, Dave, that's certainly a great radio you've got, and it works very well. The dual mode works particularly well. I know I was in the shack one night and I just had the thing on, and I didn't realise that band B was on the International Space Station frequency. And I heard the repeater ident, and oh my goodness, could that have been the ISS? And I looked up on heavens above, and yes, it had been. I didn't even know it was flying past. But anyway, I'm speaking at the moment on the 200, which is the baby brother to the one that you've got there, Dave. Anyway, back to you, Chris. I hope I wasn't too gushy or too dripping with sentimentality as far as my appreciation for your broadcast. Long may they continue, Chris, and let's not listen to the naysayers. Or as Nick, the big Australian, has said, if you don't look back, you'll only get a sore neck. Cheers, and back to you, Chris. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML. Yeah. Well, if I'm breaking the law by broadcasting, so is the Astronomical Society of Victoria with their broadcast from Hallam, I think. The ASV, which is done by Clint. So are all the radio clubs. So is the Radio Amateur Old Timers Club. I mean, there are about 30 or 40 various broadcasts, News West. And we're all covered by the same regulations, and we all try to keep to them. But amateur radio, and particularly with its demographic tending towards people in their 60s and 70s, tends to have a lot of people with ossified ideas, rigid, unbending, shaped on a hobby which is now of the past rather than looking forward. I mean, I can foresee a time when, particularly with these new digital formats, a QSO involving text and pictures and sound all together might be the go. A lecture where they're providing lecture notes, let's say, or illustrations. Let's say a group talking about a circuit. Well, they convey the circuit diagram, and if they had a radio, such as some of those we've heard discussed tonight at the top end, where a modem was integrated with the software-defined radio, as it was with, I think, one of those Barrett radios, there's no reason to stick to audio. Just, do it like an email, chuff a picture through it. We're entering a very interesting new era where computers are actually being integrated with radios rather than used external to them. One comment. The reason why I'm using Windows 7 still is that professional editing programs for video and for audio were made available for Windows 7 on a CD-ROM. and they were extremely good. The Sony Vegas was one. Adobe Audition version 3 was another. It's 20 years old, but it works extremely well. I use it every week for resynchronizing some of the out-of-sync YouTube uploads that I see. I also use Sony Vegas for crispening, or for changing gamma, or for altering color balance on a lot of these clips. And I use Adobe Audition with its waterfall display to analyse where dips and peaks in the frequency response of a narrated track are, and to correct for them. So with old optical soundtracks typically, which roll off above 1 kilohertz at something like 12 dB per octave, by the time they reach 6 kilohertz there's nothing left, can be compensated for. Now if I upgrade even to Windows 10, the emulator in that, going back a step, does not work on a lot of those professional programs, which means that if I was to go to Windows 10 or Windows 11 or whatever, Windows 1930 foot, whatever it is now, I would have to spend several $1,000s on software. And I don't want to, because if it ain't broke, I'm not going to fix it. So I'll stick with Windows 7. I've got the DVD-ROM up there. I've used it on all of my computers. There's never been a problem with it. I can't really see why I should upgrade until I'm absolutely forced to, by finding software that absolutely won't work on Windows 7, and so far I've found nothing of that description. VK3CG, are you still with us? We should start thinking about doing a final round. I cannot do Zoom this week. As I say, the second computer is there, and I've tried 3 times to sign in to Zoom and it wouldn't work. I will have to sit down with the computer and set up a new account on a different email. Maybe they've seen me using the free version of Zoom too often and they've stopped me. I don't know. I'm very sorry from the point of view of people that are too far away to get into us with radio, with our viewers in Canberra and in Auckland, for example, Rowley. So my apologies to them. VK3CG, if you're still with us, Dave. VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML on the group, VK3ECG. Yes, no, I know exactly what you mean. I'm sorry about the dropping out. Again, this is one of the problems of having a new radio, which you've spent a bit of time configuring, but haven't got round to that particular menu entry. So I had I've in the meantime, while you were talking, I've finally got into the setup aspect of the radio, and I've changed the timeout. So now I can whittle on for at least 30 minutes and it won't interfere with anything. So you can look forward to some much longer overs from now on. No, I won't do that on you. But no, I know exactly what you mean by on the Windows front. The only way of doing it, of course, is actually to set up, if you want to upgrade to Windows 10, then set up a virtual machine and run Windows 7 in the virtual machine. But that will probably cripple video editing in terms of allocation of processor time. But anyway, but yes, I mean, it's certainly interesting. I like playing over all different bits and pieces with radio and so on. So you know, I don't do as much as on as Peter does. But you know, today I was actually on 15 and working into Europe on 15, which there's just it's such a quiet band, and yet, you know, actually, if you put out a call or you listen around, you do find some really good stations. And I said last week I worked in the Pacific a few times, and on 15, I quite like 15, and my antenna actually loads up really nicely on 15. Gives me one of my lowest SWRs on 40 and 15, so that's quite a nice aspect of it. But yeah, absolutely, and I think from those legal issues, I understand where some of the people are coming from, and I'm sure you're right, Chris. But you know, there's a difference between being entertaining and entertainment. They're not the same word, and I think that's probably the distinction needs to be drawn. I expect many communications that we have in all kinds of interesting aspects of whether you're using digital or linking through the internet or whatever it might be. The whole process is entertaining. If it wasn't entertaining, we wouldn't be doing it. If you're trying to indulge in sort of self-learning, then you need it to be entertaining. Any teacher would say that teaching any subject that isn't entertaining, you're doomed to failure. So I think that's the distinction. And as you say, a lot of rag chewing is all about that and finding out about people and their experiences and so on. The bit you missed when I was on there was I was talking about replacing my antenna on the roof, and I've got these sort of ground planes for doing it, and I can see exactly why you would not wish to do that, Chris, with your setup. I've got mine on the side panel of the house attached with a sort of 2 layers of steel roof, and I can climb onto that roof, and I have done on many an occasion. I'm getting less and less keen on doing that, and when I returned trying to work on my new aerial system with this new with an expanded version of a higher gain collinear, Sully said, "You are not getting on the roof," and I think I might have to get some assistance in regard to that myself as well. Anyway, back to you. I'm probably making my final VK3AML in the group, VK3ECG.
VK3CG in the group, VK3AML. Yeah, sorry to hear about the replacement of your antenna as well. And I hope nobody in Warrandyte had trouble with anything flooding. I think Warrandyte is fairly much on a rise out of the Yarra, so I can't imagine that there are too many houses right on the Yarra that are liable to flood. The Yarra wasn't so much the problem, though. It's the rivers north of the Divide, I think, that are concerned. The Goulburn, the Murray, and a lot of the tributaries running north, Kyabram, and Pyramid Hill, I think, was flooded. And from what I see, from what 3KAL Neil sent me and I showed at the start of the session tonight, Alexandra looks like it's been hit pretty hard, and particularly infrastructure such as road surfaces and bridges out, one of which was obviously swept away this afternoon. Not so much the bridge itself, that's still there, the encroaches to it, the abutments were washed away, as I think it happened in Wilson's Promontory about 20 years ago when my friend 3SL Steve was camping down there with some of his kids. The bridge at Derby, I think, was washed away, or at least the abutments to it were, and that left a lot of people stuck at Tidal River who had to be, I think, either airlifted or boated out. Yeah, okay, I think we'll wind it up there, so I'll hand it to EWG and then ACZ, and then we'll sign clear. Over to you, John, if you have any further comments. VK3WG, VK3AML.
Yes, 3AML, VK3EGG, yes, well, as you well know, I was always an experimenter type ham, and I had things like radar and all sorts of things going. In fact, I had some of those going when I was too young to have a licence. Yes, well, now 3SLR, that's what I was going to comment. That's how we found out John Wickham had died, because John Wickham disappeared, and Anthony had the Salvation Army with the police looking for a missing person, because if you look up on births, deaths and marriages, it's a useless site. In fact, it's a waste of taxpayers' money, because when people die, they don't appear on there. It should be abolished, and they could probably use the funds for that to give people on welfare an increase on their pension check or something. It would be far more useful. And yes, after about 6 months of the Salvation Army and the police and the missing person search going on, which probably cost a whole lot of money, 3SLR told, I think it was Jeff Sylvester, that John Wickham had actually died. Well, we didn't know that. It took us 6 months to find out he died. So that's very useful indeed, and I don't think it's worth having that department there at all. Yes. So what else? I had something else. Oh yes. The 160 metre people. Well, I guess with them, on the coffee break, it's tough titties to them because Dave has now got a licence to broadcast whatever he likes, and why don't they get off their bum and get a shortwave licence as well? Or just get a little bit less conservative and do things on 160 like Mr. Branch used to do or whatever. Because I think the trouble with a lot of these amateurs is they forget that this is a hobby of self-experimentation, education in the radio communication art, and they instead like to convert it to a hobby of being an amateur policeman. Well, I have no time for amateur policemen, and I don't think anyone else should either. They're probably one of the worst scourges of the hobby. And there's something else I can't quite remember now for waiting so long, so I'll put it by for the moment, and to whoever does take it, VK3, GG bye.
No worries, John. I tend to agree with you. You've obviously listened to the clip on Dave's channel, and I found it somewhat disgusting but somewhat predictable. I was involved with that coffee break session back before 2014, but found that the more I was there, the more it was becoming toxic, and I backed off. There are a lot of people there for whom I have a huge amount of respect, Drew 3XU particularly, and most of them, but there are some that won't shut up about politics, and there were some that won't shut up about their opinion of what amateur radio should be. While we're on the subject of Dave, I should let people know he's on 4835 kilohertz and 2310 kilohertz, and I can only suggest that people listen in after 3 p.m. any day on either of those two frequencies. Should be able to get them if you're anywhere from the middle of South Australia to Rotorua, New Zealand, according to the web SDRs I've dialed up. You should be able to get Dave's transmissions there. The other thing that I was meaning to draw attention to Dave's VK3ASC YouTube channel for was we've been talking today about local manufacturing, and Dave has an absolutely excellent series of, I think, 2 or 3 videos on the products of Bayer Industries, the Bayer 77 Mark I professional tape recorder and the Bayer 66, its semi-professional equivalent, which were produced in the mid-50s and very advanced machines for their time. Max Bayer also produced disc cutting equipment and a number of other pieces of apparatus. I think he was involved with amplifier construction and radio receiver construction for a while. Bayer Industries produced quite a large number of products, including a local version of the Magnacord. So you'll find all of that information on Dave's YouTube channel, the VK3ASE YouTube channel, and I can only recommend people go there and have a good look. Have a good look at it. Dave does an excellent job, and I have the highest respect for him as a program maker, as a researcher, and as a person. So it's round to Peter, I think, to tie the ribbons, unless anybody else would like to break in. VK3ACZ with a pause, and apologies to Rolly in Auckland. I'm sorry, I just cannot get Zoom to work tonight. VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3ACZ, and I'm going to give Rolly a bit of a plug because I've been watching some of his videos this week and been really enjoying them, and I was looking forward to commenting about them tonight. I can save it till next week. Anybody wants to be very entertained, Zulu Lima 1 Bravo Quebec Delta, look him up on YouTube. Always good value, very enjoyable. And as are yours, Chris, and thank you so much for tonight's broadcast. Just last word on the floods. It was raining so heavily overnight, I was laying in bed listening to it and thinking, oh no, not more of the same. But I do remember the photos of 1974 floods in Seymour, the locomotive depot. The locomotives were way up past the bogies in flood waters and all that around the turntable and all that at Seymour Loco. Those pictures are stuck in my mind. Pretty awful times. Anyway, the Rosebud Hamfest is coming up soon, 20th of November. I'm looking forward to going. The reason why I say that is I've only just found out today I've got a leave pass, so we'll be able to go from other commitments I normally have on a Sunday. Best regards to Prue there. Hope she's on the improve, Chris, and that things improve for you both in that situation. Just thanks again. Thanks to everybody else for coming up to Dave. Dave, the DX on 15. Good stuff, mate. I was glad to hear that. When was it? About 6 p.m. I got Delta Kilo 8 Mike Zulu Wolf near Munich in Germany on 15 metres too. So on the long path, that was quite enjoyable. So yes, the solar flux could be a lot higher, but it's high enough that there are some good contacts to be had. Anyway, cheers and 7-3, Chris, and to everybody else, and look forward to next week. VK3AML, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for calling in, 3ACZ, 3HAG, 3ECG, 3EGG, and on, just hang on a sec, and on the text chat, John Young, 3FTJS, Nick Presser, VK3BA, VK3WL, looking up Tom George in Ballarat, VK3 Pirate, I think that's Greg, VK3ND, and all of the rest of you, Alan, VK3BV, the news of Alan 3BV's demise, I should say. Ashley Geelan, thank you. ZL1BQD, always a pleasure to have you there, and I'm sorry to have to dip out this week. Anyway, now that it's nearly 12:39 a.m. in Melbourne town, I'll make the Mother Grundies really angry, intentionally. I'll put a new way of calling CQ. It's called Cooey, and I have a recorded version of it here from, would you believe, 1928. The guy that composed this name was Heck McLennan, one of the great popular singers of Australia in the roaring 1920s of 100 years ago. He had a son named Rod McLennan that many of you will remember as a pop singer in the 1970s. Rod McLennan's father. And here we go.
Say, what is all that noise you're making around here? Why, that is a real Australian bush call. Well, why do that now? Well, boys, I'm calling to you. Oh, hear my plea, come back to me. If you call to me, I'll fly to you, wherever you be. I've built a little shack by that old bush track. Won't you please come and share it with me? Then I'll be happy when we call coo-wee. So hear my plea, come back to me. You went away one summer day. You didn't say goodbye. Why did you go? When you must know, without you I should, without you I'd die, I'd die. I'm calling to you, for hear my plea, come back to me. If you call to me, you fill my heart with glee. I'll fly to you. Wherever you be, just try and see. I've built a little shack way back by that old bush track. Won't you please come and share it with me? Then I'll be happy when we go coo-wee. So hear my plea, come back to me. I've built a little shack way back by that old bush track. Won't you please come and share it with me? Oh gee, how happy we'll be. And I'll be happy when we go coo-wee. Hear my plea, come back to me. Coo-wee.
So you see, there's more than one way of calling CQ, and this is VK3AML closing down for this 22nd of October 2022, reminding you that next Saturday we will have interviews with ZL40M, Mike, and talking about life at the extreme southern end, the outback effectively of New Zealand, and some of the communication, the unique communication facilities they have in that part of the world, including a very active radio club, of which you will hear and see more. So this is VK3AML closing down for the 22nd of October 2022. Thanks for having me in your home. And so, thank you to all the people on the stream. It's getting very late. And Ashley, nice to see you there still on the chat as well. I think we've got more concurrent viewers tonight than we've ever had before for some strange reason. I don't know why you people come back again. I'm just glad that there is some sort of a niche audience for this sort of technical material. All the best until next week, and thank you for being there. Cheers, folks. I'm just trying to find the button.